She built the empire. He burned it down in one night. Now every crime family on the East Coast is watching to see what she does next. If you've made it this far, don't leave. This story is going to take you somewhere you won't expect. Hit that like button before we begin, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The ballroom smelled like old money and fresh betrayal. 15 floors above Manhattan's west side, inside the Caldwell Grand Hotel's sovereign floor, a space that hadn't been rented to a civilian in 11 years, 300 of the most dangerous people on the eastern seaboard sat behind crystal glasses and white linen tablecloths and pretended, for one evening, that they were something other than what they were. The chandeliers above the sovereign ballroom were original 19th century Austrian crystal, each one restored at a cost most legitimate businesses would recognize as their annual operating budget. The marble beneath their feet was imported. The wine breathing in the decanters had been selected by a sommelier who did not know, and would never know, whose cellar he'd raided to fill this particular room on this particular night. Every year the sovereign's banquet took place in November. Every year it began precisely at 7 in the evening and ended precisely at midnight, and not 1 minute before or after, because the man who ran it believed that discipline in ceremony translated to discipline in commerce. That man was Roman Vescari. He stood at the head of the room near the elevated dais, not yet seated, because Roman Vescari did not sit until he chose to sit. He was 61 years old and carried his age the way a blade carries rust, not as weakness, but as evidence of having been through things that would have destroyed a lesser piece of steel. He was broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, with a jawline that hadn't softened despite the decades and the food and the bourbon. He wore charcoal. He always wore charcoal. His cufflinks were simple, burnished gold, no monogram, because men who needed their initials on their jewelry were men who weren't sure anyone would remember them. People remembered Roman Vescari. On his left stood Dario Mantovese, his consigliere and childhood friend, a thin man with patient eyes who had not smiled genuinely in approximately 12 years. Dario was surveying the room with the quiet focus of a man cataloging potential problems before they became actual ones. Beside Dario stood 2 security personnel so physically imposing they seemed to alter the geometry of the space around them. On Roman's right stood Vivian Ashcroft Vescari. She wore deep burgundy, not because it was the color of power, but because she had worn it to their first meeting 22 years ago in a back corridor of a Boston hotel, not entirely unlike this one, and Roman had never forgotten it, and so she had never stopped. It was the only vanity she permitted herself in public, the small archaeology of who they used to be. Her hair was dark, pinned back at the base of her neck, and her posture was the kind that doesn't come from training, but from having decided sometime in her late 20s that she would never again allow herself to appear smaller than she was. She was 53. She looked like a woman who had survived things she would never discuss at dinner. The room filled slowly. It always did. Arriving exactly on time to an event like this one was considered the behavior of the anxious or the eager, neither of which you wanted to project. The heads of the 5 major families along the corridor from Providence down through Baltimore arrived in their own time, greeted Roman with the particular handshakes and half-embraces that communicated hierarchy without requiring words. The Hargrove people from upstate, the Pelletier family out of Montreal with their American interests, representatives from 3 independent organizations that operated under informal agreements of mutual non-interference, men whose names did not appear in any public record and who preferred it precisely that way. Each of them, upon reaching the dais and Roman's extended hand, turned also to Vivienne. Most kissed her cheek. Several held her hand a beat longer than courtesy required. Don Salvatore Carucci, 80 years old and still sharp enough to read a room faster than men half his age, cupped her face between both palms when he greeted her and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Vivienne smiled at him, a real smile, the kind she didn't manufacture, and Carucci nodded once like a man who'd confirmed something he already suspected. Roman watched none of this. He was working the room, accepting the tributes, the assessments, the careful jockeying that preceded formal proceedings. This was his element. The weight of a room's attention was something he'd metabolized long ago. It no longer excited him, but he understood its necessity the way he understood the necessity of breathing. You did it continuously, or you stopped existing. Vivian watched all of it. She stood slightly behind Roman's right shoulder, which was her customary position in public settings, and she cataloged the room the way she always did, not with anxiety, but with the practiced attention of someone who understood that information was the only currency that never depreciated. She noticed which family representatives sat together and which avoided each other's sight lines. She noticed that the Pellegrino organization from Philadelphia was short two senior figures who should have been present. She noticed that a young man she didn't recognize was seated at the Morrow family table, positioned too centrally for a junior figure, and that the Morrow patriarch, Vincent, had not yet made eye contact with anyone across the room. A tell for a man who usually worked every angle before the first course arrived. She filed these things away. She always filed things away. Dinner proceeded. 7 courses, each one an exercise in conspicuous civility. Men who had ordered killings over territorial disputes, passing the breadbasket to each other, and asking after grandchildren and summer houses. The conversations were surface, coded, careful. Real business wasn't conducted at the table. The table was theater. The table was where you demonstrated that you were someone capable of sitting across from a dangerous man and eating calmly, which was itself a form of communication. Vivian ate little. She listened much. She laughed at the appropriate moments and said less than anyone at the table, which had always been her method and which was consistently misread by people who didn't know her as evidence that she was decorative rather than functional. She had never corrected this misreading. The misreading had, on more than one occasion, saved lives, including her own. It was between the 5th and 6th courses, during the particular lull that sets in when a room full of people has consumed enough food and wine to lower their guard slightly, that Roman Viscari set down his glass and rose from his chair. He didn't tap the glass. He didn't clear his throat. He simply stood, and the room understood immediately from the quality of his stillness that something was happening. "I want to take a moment," he said, "before the formal proceedings begin. A personal matter." Vivian did not look up from her plate immediately. Something in his cadence was wrong. After 22 years, she knew his cadences the way a weather reader knows cloud formations, not just the shape of them, but what they signaled about what was coming. This one was careful, rehearsed, the cadence of a man who had made a decision and steeled himself against the possibility of being talked out of it. She looked up. Standing near the entrance to the ballroom, in a gown the color of champagne, was Celeste Arden. Vivian had known about Celeste Arden for 7 months. She had known in the way that she knew most things, not because anyone told her, but because she paid attention to the texture of silences and absences and the small inconsistencies that accumulated around a man who was hiding something significant. She had said nothing. She had filed it away like everything else and waited to understand what it meant for the architecture of things. She understood now. "Celeste, Roman said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Come up here." The woman walked forward with the careful grace of someone who had practiced this moment. She was perhaps 32, blonde in the way that photographs well, with the kind of composure that requires effort to maintain. She took Roman's extended hand and stood beside him, and Roman placed her hand at the crook of his arm with a deliberateness that was its own announcement. "After 22 years, Roman said to the room, certain arrangements in my personal life are changing. Celeste will be taking the role of the primary consort of the Viscari house going forward. I want every family represented here tonight to recognize her in that position." He paused. "She is the new queen of this house." The ballroom went so quiet that Vivian could hear the ice shifting in the water glasses. She became aware, in the immediate aftermath, of the particular quality of attention that 300 people can focus on a single point. She was that point. Every pair of eyes in the room that wasn't watching Roman was watching her. Not salaciously, not cruelly, but with the focused alertness of people who understood that they were witnessing something that would have consequences, and that the nature of those consequences depended entirely on what happened in the next 30 seconds. Vivian set her fork down. The sound of it was very small and very precise against the plate. She took a breath. She had spent 22 years in a world that mistook silence for submission and stillness for weakness, and she had never corrected this misreading either. She had let men underestimate her at every table she'd ever sat at, in every room she'd ever entered, and she had let Roman Vescari believe, in whatever corner of himself required that particular belief, that her steadiness was a function of his protection rather than her own constitution. She looked at Roman. He met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds before looking away, which told her everything she needed to know about the depth of his certainty. Certain men don't look away. She reached to her left hand. The ring had been on her finger for 22 years and had developed the slight groove in the skin beneath it that only time creates. And as she worked it loose, she felt the cool air of the room meet the faint pale circle it left behind. She set the ring on the white tablecloth beside her water glass. She stood. The room had already been silent, but somehow it got quieter. Vivienne looked at the assembled families, not at Roman, not at Celeste, but at the room, and when she spoke, her voice was level and unhurried and carried without effort. "Thank you," she said, "for 22 years of trust." She stepped away from the table. She did not rush. She did not weep. She walked across the marble floor of the sovereign ballroom of the Caldwell Grand Hotel, with her spine straight and her chin level, and the burgundy of her dress moving quietly around her heels, and she pushed through the double doors at the far end of the room, and she was gone. The silence she left behind lasted for a long time. It lasted long enough for Roman Viscari to look around the room with the expression of a man who has made a calculation he was certain about and is only now registering that the variables were different than he thought. It lasted long enough for Dario Mantovese, standing slightly behind his employer's right shoulder, to close his eyes for exactly 1 second in the manner of a man absorbing the early evidence of a catastrophe. Then Vincent Morrow stood up from his chair. He was 64, a thick-necked man from Delaware whose family had controlled the Mid-Atlantic corridor for 3 decades. He wasn't a demonstrative person. He didn't make speeches. He pushed his chair back from the table and stood, and the quality of his standing was not aggressive, but it was definitive. And then he walked away from the table, toward the doors that Vivienne had just used. Felix Carucci stood next, the eldest son of Don Salvatore, who was too old to move quickly, but who rose with his son's assistance and nodded once toward the door. The Hargrove contingent. 2 of the Pelletier representatives, Madeline Croft, who ran the Croft family's Boston operations since her brother's death, and who was one of perhaps 4 people in the room that Roman was genuinely cautious around. An independent operator named Gus Theodorus, who had done business with Vivienne years before Roman was even aware of his existence. One by one, then in clusters. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't look at Roman as they rose. They simply moved, with the quiet, unhurried purposefulness of people who had made a collective decision without a word being exchanged, because some decisions don't require words. They moved toward the door, through the door, into the hallway beyond where Vivienne Ashcroft Viscari had paused, not because she was waiting for them, but because she had stopped at the large window at the end of the corridor and was looking out at the city, and the city was doing what it always did, which was existing with magnificent indifference to any single human drama being conducted within it. Roman stood at the head of the empty ballroom. 300 chairs, most of them now vacant. Celeste Arden's hand was still in the crook of his arm, and she was very still, and her composure had developed a faint crack along the surface of it, not visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but Dario, still standing at Roman's left, was looking for it. The crystal chandeliers swung almost imperceptibly in the ventilation current from the open doors. The banquet that was supposed to begin the annual renewal of the East Coast Alliance structure, the loyalty agreements, the territorial acknowledgments, the formal recommitment of every family to the architecture of mutual non-destruction that kept the criminal underworld from consuming itself. That banquet was not going to happen tonight. Roman Vescari understood this with the cold, full-body comprehension of a man watching a building he thought was solid reveal that it had been built around a person rather than around stone. In the hallway, the gathered families formed a loose circle around Vivienne Ashcroft, without anyone directing them to do so. She had turned from the window and was looking at them with an expression that was not gratified and not surprised, but simply present, the expression of a woman who understood what was happening and was choosing, carefully, what it meant. Don Carucci's son Felix stepped forward first. "Whatever you need," he said. It was not a condolence. It was a statement of availability. Vincent Morrow, standing to her left, said nothing. He simply stood there, which for Vincent Morrow was the equivalent of a formal declaration. Vivienne looked at the assembled faces, men and women who controlled territories from Boston to Baltimore, who had spent decades in rooms with Roman Viscari and had signed agreements and shaken hands and maintained, through various seasons of violence and prosperity, the kind of brittle peace that required constant, invisible maintenance. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from finally seeing something you've known for a long time, that these people had never been loyal to the Viscari name. They had been loyal to her. She had known it theoretically. She had understood it the way you understand a thing when you're inside it, which is to say, incompletely, because the inside of a structure rarely gives you its full dimensions. But seeing it arranged in the hallway around her, seeing it in the way Felix Carucci stood, and the way Morrow didn't need to speak, and the way Madeline Croft was watching her with that particular flat-eyed assessment that meant Madeline had already run the numbers and reached a conclusion. Seeing it like this from the outside for the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had built, and the full weight of what Roman had just destroyed. She didn't let any of this appear on her face. She thanked them, each of them, with the specificity that they had earned. A word to Felix about his father's health, a question to Vincent about his granddaughter's college placement, a brief, genuine exchange with Madeline about a piece of business they had quietly resolved together the previous spring without either of their organization's formal knowledge. She moved through the circle with the attention of a woman who had always understood that relationships were not maintained in grand moments, but in the accumulated evidence of small ones. Then she excused herself and walked to the elevator bank alone. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. She stood in the mirrored elevator car and looked at her own reflection for the 17 seconds it took to descend, and her face in the mirror was the face of a woman doing the kind of internal mathematics that doesn't show on the surface because showing it would require her to acknowledge that she hadn't seen this coming. Not the fact of it. She had always known Roman was capable of this. But the timing, the staging, the deliberate public theater of it, the specific choice to use the sovereign's banquet as the venue, the one night a year when every significant player in the Eastern underworld was present in one room. He hadn't just ended their marriage. He had tried to establish a succession. He had tried to use the weight of ceremony to transfer her position to a woman with no relationships, no history, no architecture of trust built across 2 decades of invisible labor. He had tried to install a figure beside him and have 300 dangerous people simply acknowledge the substitution, the way you acknowledge a new paint color in a room you didn't design. He had misunderstood, fundamentally, what 300 dangerous people were actually doing every year when they flew in from Providence and Montreal and Baltimore and sat at his table. The elevator opened. The lobby of the Caldwell Grand was all dark wood and subdued lighting, and a concierge who recognized her and whose expression shifted in a small, controlled way as she crossed the marble floor. Something had reached the lobby already, the way information always reached the lobby before you did in places like this. She walked past him without stopping. The night air hit her at the revolving door. November in Manhattan, sharp and cold, and smelling of exhaust and something almost clean underneath it, the way the city sometimes surprised you. She stopped on the sidewalk. A car was already there. Not because she had called one, but because Emmett, her driver of 11 years, had a particular instinct about when he needed to be where, an instinct that she had come to rely on without ever fully explaining or requiring. She got in. "Mrs. Viscari," Emmett said, and then caught himself, and she saw the small adjustment in his posture in the rear-view mirror. "It's Ashcroft," she said quietly, going forward. "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "Home?" She looked out at the window at the hotel's facade, at the light pouring from the 15th floor where 300 people were currently processing what had just happened. She thought about the apartment that had been her home for 14 years, the apartment that was technically Roman's, in a building that Roman had owned since before they met, in a neighborhood that Roman's family had maintained relationships with since before she was born. "No," she said, "the Ashford Arms." "Mom, Daddy stay." It was the name of a small hotel in Midtown that she maintained a permanent suite at under her mother's maiden name, had maintained it for 6 years. Not because she had anticipated this particular night, but because she had always understood that a woman in her position needed a door that only she had a key to. And Emmett, ma'am. Don't tell anyone you've heard this yet. Give it 12 hours. Yes, ma'am. The car pulled into traffic. Vivian Ashcroft watched the city move past the window and felt, beneath the cold clarity of the shock she wasn't permitting herself to process yet, the first faint tremor of something that was not anger and not grief, but something older and quieter. The particular sensation of a woman who has been patient for a very long time, finally, irreversibly, running out of reason to continue. 3 hours later, in a private dining room on the hotel's 14th floor, Roman Vescari sat across from Dario Mantovese with a glass of bourbon and the specific silence of a man who has begun to understand the scale of a miscalculation. "Tell me," Roman said. Dario had a yellow legal pad in front of him. He looked at it for a moment before looking up. 7 confirmed withdrawals from the alliance discussions tonight. Preliminary. I'd expect more by morning. Who? Morrow. Both Caruccis. The Hargrove organization entirely. Madeline Croft, Theodorus, and... Dario paused in a way that had weight. Pellegrino. Roman's jaw worked. Pellegrino wasn't even in the room. No, he called Felix Carucci at 11:43. Word travels. The bourbon sat untouched. Roman looked at the glass without seeing it. She did something, he said. She must have... She's been working them. Building this. This didn't happen in one night. Dario was very still for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way of a man carrying something fragile. Roman, she didn't do anything tonight. That's the point. Roman looked up. She walked out, Dario said. She walked out, and they followed, because what they were following had nothing to do with tonight. He set his pen down. How many of those families, how many of those relationships do you know the origin story of? Not the version you know, the real version, when it started and what was exchanged and who was in the room. Roman said nothing. I can tell you some of them, Dario said. I've been doing some accounting tonight. The Moro Territory dispute in 2014. You remember the Moro Territory dispute? You gave a speech about strength and took the credit. What you don't know is that Vivian spent 3 weeks prior to that speech meeting privately with every affected party and building the compromise that made the speech possible. The Carucci debt situation in 2017, you authorized the pressure campaign. Vivian quietly negotiated a restructured arrangement with Salvatore directly that made the pressure campaign unnecessary and prevented what would have been a very significant confrontation. The Pelletier heir in 2019, enough, Roman said. Dario stopped. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the hotel, music was playing from the ballroom where the Sovereign's banquet had officially ended 2 hours early. I built this organization, Roman said. His voice was low. It had the quality of a man talking to himself more than to another person, before she was part of it, before any of them knew her name. You built the name, Dario said. She built the reason for it to mean anything. He said it without cruelty, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed this conversation many times in private and has decided that tonight is the night to have it. Roman, I'm not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because in the next 72 hours you are going to need to make decisions, and you need to make them with a clear understanding of what actually exists and what you thought existed. Those are two different things. Roman reached for the bourbon, held it, didn't drink. Where is she? I don't know, Dario said, and then carefully, I don't think that's the right question. Then what's the right question? The right question, Dario said, is who she is going to talk to in the morning and what she's going to say, and whether you have any capacity to influence either of those things. A pause. And my assessment, my honest assessment, which you're paying me to provide, is that you don't. Not directly. Not anymore. Roman set the glass down without drinking from it. Then what do I have? He said. It came out quieter than he intended. It came out like the question it actually was. Dario Mantovese, who had known Roman Vescari since they were 12 years old and had watched him build something real from almost nothing, and had also watched him, incrementally, and then all at once confuse the structure with the person who had learned to hold it upright, looked at his oldest friend for a long moment. "You have time," Dario said, "if you use it correctly." But even as he said it, the legal pad in front of him held three names that had not yet been mentioned. Three names that represented not just withdrawn alliance commitments, but active intelligence suggesting a coordinated effort to use the current instability as an entry point for something far more dangerous than a restructured seating arrangement. Dario had not shared these names yet. He was still calculating what sharing them would cost. Outside, the city continued its enormous, indifferent life, and in a suite at the Ashford Arms, Vivian Ashcroft sat in a chair near the window with her shoes off and a glass of water she hadn't touched, and her phone face down on the table beside her, and she was thinking about the three names that had appeared in her own private intelligence over the last week. The same three names, she suspected, that were sitting somewhere in Dario Mantovesi's careful notes, and what those names meant about the week that was about to follow. She had spent 22 years preventing the thing that was now, it appeared, about to begin, and for the first time she was not sure she had any reason left to stop it. The call came at 4:53 in the morning. Vivian had not slept. She had sat in the chair by the window of the Ashford Arms suite and watched the city move through its nighttime phases. The late traffic thinning, the delivery trucks beginning, the particular gray that preceded dawn accumulating at the edges of the skyline like something being poured slowly into the spaces between buildings. She had not touched the water. She had not touched her phone. She had thought with the concentrated, unhurried attention of a woman who understood that the next 72 hours would require her to have already done the thinking before they arrived. When the phone finally lit up, the name on the screen was Felix Carucci. She answered on the second ring. "It's early," she said. "I know." His voice was tight in a way that Felix Carucci's voice was not normally tight. Felix was 41, his father's designated heir, a man who had grown up watching how power moved and had internalized its grammar with the fluency of someone for whom there had never been any other language. Tightness in his voice meant something specific. "Are you secure?" "Reasonably." "We have a problem that isn't about last night." She waited. "There was a meeting," Felix said. "Not last night, 3 weeks ago, in Newark. We didn't know about it until 2 hours ago. One of our people was approached after the fact by someone looking to defect. The meeting involved representatives from the Stroud organization, Kellerman's people out of Baltimore, and at least one senior figure from the Aldrich network." Vivian was very still. The Stroud organization was not on her list of anticipated problems. Kellerman she had been watching for 14 months. The Aldrich network was something else entirely. A consortium of younger operations that had been accumulating territory and capital in the gaps left by the established family's various internal struggles, operating with a patience and coordination that had struck her when she'd first mapped their activity patterns as unusual for organizations of their age and size. "What was the agenda?" she said. "Our source doesn't have the full picture. What they have is a name that came up repeatedly." A pause. "Yours." She let the pause sit for a moment before responding. "In what context?" "In the context of you being the obstacle," Felix said. "Not Roman. You, specifically. The framing, as our source understood it, was that the alliance structure has been maintained by one person for the past 15 years, and that person is no longer in a position where she has any reason to maintain it. And that represents—" He stopped. Started again. The word used was opportunity. Vivian stood up from the chair. She moved to the window and looked out at the city in its early morning gray and felt something she rarely permitted herself to feel, which was the specific cold of being seen clearly by people whose interest in you was predatory. "When was this meeting?" she said. 3 weeks ago Thursday. 3 weeks ago Thursday. Before last night. Before the sovereign's banquet. Before Roman's announcement." She calculated the timeline with the automatic rapidity of a mind that had always tracked the relationship between events and their origins. "Felix," she said. "Yeah." "Was the Newark meeting before or after Roman told Celeste Arden she would be attending the banquet as his consort?" A silence. "I don't know when he told her." "Find out." She ended the call and stood with the phone in her hand and looked at the pale gray light coming through the window and understood that the shape of what had happened last night was not what she had initially assessed it to be. She had read it as Roman's ego, Roman's impatience, Roman's fundamental inability, after 22 years, to tolerate the evidence that the respect shown to him in rooms like the sovereign's ballroom was to a significant degree a product of her presence beside him. She had read it as a man burning something down because he could no longer bear to share credit for having built it. She had not read it as coordinated. But if the Newark meeting had happened before the banquet, if people whose interest was in destabilizing the alliance structure had known, 3 weeks in advance, that Roman was about to publicly humiliate her and remove her from her position, then either those people had access to Roman's private plans, or they had access to Roman himself. The second possibility sat in her chest like something cold and dense. She dressed quickly, called Emmett, and was in the car by 5:15. She didn't go to her office. She didn't have an office, technically. She had always considered offices to be the kind of fixed location that made people easy to find. And Vivian Ashcroft had never wanted to be easy to find. She directed Emmett to a building in the West 40s that contained on its 3rd floor a suite of rooms registered to a property management company whose beneficial ownership would have taken a dedicated investigator the better part of a month to trace back to her. Emmett dropped her at the service entrance without being asked. The rooms were clean and warm and equipped with the things she needed: a secure line, a filing system that lived entirely in her head, and its physical counterpart in 3 encrypted drives in 3 separate locations, and a coffee maker that she used now, while the city outside began its morning escalation. She was on her 2nd call by 5:45, her 3rd by 6, and by 7 in the morning she had spoken to 9 people across 4 cities and had assembled enough information to understand that what she was looking at was not a series of coincidences, but an architecture. The Stroud organization had been systematically acquiring assets in territories adjacent to Viscari Holdings for 18 months, not competing with them, acquiring adjacent to them, in the specific pattern of someone mapping the perimeter of a structure before attempting to breach it. Kellerman in Baltimore had made 3 separate approaches to mid-level Viscari figures in the past year, approaches that had been reported up the chain and which Roman had dismissed as opportunistic rather than coordinated. The Aldrich network had been placing personnel inside support operations, legitimate businesses that served the established families as front infrastructure, for longer than that. Patient, coordinated, invisible at the individual level, visible only in aggregate. She had seen the individual signals. She had not, until this morning, assembled them into the aggregate picture, because she had been operating inside the alliance structure rather than outside it, and from inside a structure you could not always see its external vulnerabilities. At 7:42, someone knocked on the door. She had not given this location to anyone that morning. She had not given it to Felix. She had not told Emmett where she was going, only which block to drop her on. She moved to the door without sound and looked through the optical viewer. Dario Mantovesi stood in the hallway with his coat buttoned and his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has not slept and who has spent the sleepless hours making a decision he is not entirely certain about. She opened the door. "How?" she said. "You used this address for a property tax appeal in 2019, he said. "I did the research at the time and filed it away. You know I file things away." She held the door open. He came in, looked around the room with the brief assessment of a man confirming what he'd expected, and sat down in the chair near the window. The same chair she'd been sitting in all night, in the other room, in the other building. He looked like the chair matched him. "Tell me what you have," she said. He looked up. "You first." The silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who have been navigating the same complex territory from different positions and have arrived simultaneously at the recognition that they are looking at the same thing. "Newark," she said. 3 weeks ago. Stroud, Kellerman, Aldrich. Something shifted in Dario's face. "My source only had Kellerman and Aldrich. Stroud is new." "How new?" "If Stroud was in that room, then the capitalization is significantly larger than I estimated." He put his hat on his knee. "The Stroud organization has been liquid in ways that don't correspond to their reported operations for approximately 2 years. I flagged it twice. Roman decided it was market conditions." And the access question. Dario was quiet for a moment. Yes. Before or after? The approach to Roman was made 4 weeks ago, Dario said. I don't have confirmation it was an approach. What I have is a record of a meeting between Roman and a figure I can't fully identify, in a location that wasn't logged on his calendar 2 days before he told Celeste about the banquet. Vivian sat down across from him. The coffee was on the table between them, and she poured a second cup and put it in front of him because this was, at its core, a conversation between two people who had spent 2 decades doing the careful, invisible work of keeping something complicated from falling apart, and some habits operated beneath the level of calculation. They got to him, she said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what they offered him or how they framed it, but the sequence. Dario stopped, restarted. The sequence is not coincidental. If they knew the alliance structure well enough to identify you as the load-bearing element, then they knew that removing you was the first move. And if Roman was persuaded or manipulated or simply allowed to do what he'd wanted to do for some time, under circumstances that were manufactured to be convenient, then last night wasn't Roman's idea, Vivian said. It was their idea, delivered to a man who was already inclined toward it. Dario nodded once. She thought about Roman standing at the head of the sovereign ballroom with Celeste Arden on his arm, and the particular look on his face, the look she had read as certainty and arrogance and had not read, because she had been too close to it, as something else. She thought about the way he had met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. She thought about the 2 seconds and what lived in them. He hadn't been certain. He had been afraid. And he had done it anyway, because someone had convinced him that what would happen next was manageable, that without her steadying influence, the families would fall in line around him because that was what families always did when the dominant figure held firm. They had told him a story about power that confirmed what he already wanted to believe, and he had believed it because wanting to believe something is its own form of intelligence failure. He doesn't know, she said. Almost certainly not. Where is he now? The hotel. He hasn't left. He has... Celeste is with him. Dario's voice on the name carried nothing, which was a form of carrying something. He called 3 of the family heads this morning. None of them took the call. Who did he call? Morrow first, then Hargrove, then, interestingly, Pellegrino. Vivian noted the choice of Pellegrino. Roman had always privately considered the Philadelphia operation to be the weakest link in the alliance, the family most susceptible to pressure, the most likely to calculate short-term advantage over long-term stability. If Roman was trying to rebuild after last night by starting with Pellegrino, he was working from an accurate list of who might be movable and an inaccurate understanding of why they had moved in the first place. He's going to make it worse, she said. Yes. And if Kellerman or Aldrich or whoever is running this operation from the outside reaches Pellegrino before Roman does, Philadelphia flips, Dario said. And once Philadelphia flips, the Mid-Atlantic corridor is open. And if the corridor is open, coast-wide war. She said it flatly. No drama in it, just the weight of the actual words. Dario put both hands on his knees and looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When have I not? Last night, before it happened, did you know? She looked at him steadily. I knew about Celeste. For how long? 7 months. His jaw tightened very slightly. And you didn't... What would I have done, Dario? Her voice was even. Gone to Roman. Confronted him. Given him the opportunity to make it a negotiation? She shook her head. You know what Roman does when he's cornered on a personal matter. He escalates. Whatever I did privately would have become public, on his terms, in a way that would have been worse. You could have come to me. You work for Roman. I've been working for both of you for 20 years and you know it. The silence held. She looked at her coffee cup. Yes, she said. I know it. A pause. And I needed to know what he would choose to do when he thought no one was watching. That was more valuable than whatever I could have prevented. Dario absorbed this. So you let it happen. I let him show me who he was deciding to be. She looked up. And now I know. The morning was fully established outside the windows. The city was at full volume. Somewhere several floors below them, a delivery entrance was being operated with the particular rhythmic banging of a man doing a physical job with more energy than strictly necessary. "What do you need?" Dario said. "I need to know who in the Viscari organization is clean. Not loyal to Roman, clean. People who have not been contacted by the outside consortium and who would, if they understood the full picture, make decisions based on self-preservation rather than hierarchy." "That's most of the mid-level structure," Dario said. "Roman's upper captains are complicated. 2 of them I'm already uncertain about." "Which 2? He told her. She filed them. "I also need," she said, "to know the identity of the unidentified figure Roman met with 4 weeks ago." "I'm working on it." "Work faster." He nodded. He picked up his hat from his knee and held it for a moment. "Vivian, whatever you're building, whatever the next move is, I want you to understand that my first obligation is to preventing what happens if this falls apart completely. Not to Roman, not to the Viscari name." He paused. "I've watched you do this work for 20 years. I know what it cost you. I'm not asking you to do it again for the same reasons." She looked at him for a long moment. "The reasons are different," she said. He stood, put on his hat, and went to the door. He had his hand on the knob when she spoke again. "Dario." He turned. "The 2 captains you're uncertain about. Don't move on them yet. Let them believe we don't know." He considered this. "You want them as a channel." "I want them as a window," she said. "There's a difference." He left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor and then went to the secure line and made a call she had been postponing since 5 in the morning because she had needed to know more before making it. The call was to Madeline Croft in Boston. Madeline answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. "I've been thinking about you since 11 o'clock last night," Madeline said. Her voice was dry and direct, the voice of a woman who had no patience for the theatrical elements of any conversation. "Tell me you're not sitting somewhere having feelings about it." "I'm sitting somewhere building a map," Vivian said. "Good." The sound of a chair moving. "Because I have something for you that came in at 2 in the morning from a contact in Baltimore that I think is going to change your understanding of the timeline." A pause. "The Kellerman approach to the Mid-Atlantic corridor has been active for 30 months, Vivian, not 14. The earlier activity was deliberately structured to look like market noise. Someone with significant strategic sophistication shaped what you were seeing." 30 months. 2.5 years. The weight of it settled on her like a change in atmospheric pressure. Everything she had been tracking, every signal she had mapped, had been curated, shown to her in the shape that was most useful to the people doing the showing. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had sat at tables with people who frightened other people professionally, and she had remained steady. But the cold that moved through her now was the cold of genuine respect for whoever had designed this, the cold of recognizing a level of patience and orchestration that she had not, in 22 years, encountered before. 30 months, she said. Minimum. Madeline's voice was careful. Which means this predates several things we've been attributing to other causes. The Morrow territorial dispute in 2024. The problems with the Pellegrino succession. The Hargrove leadership transition. A pause. Someone has been pulling at the threads of the alliance structure for 2.5 years systematically, testing each seam. And they found the one that mattered, Vivian said. They found you, Madeline said. And then they found a way to move you. The line was quiet for a moment. I need to see you, Vivian said. I thought you might. Another pause. I'm already in the city. I came down last night. I had a feeling the morning was going to require proximity. A beat. And Vivian, I'm not the only one. Vincent Morrow is at the Meridian. Theodorus flew in early. We've been talking since 6. A pause that had a specific weight to it. We want to know what you know, and we want to know what you're going to do about it. She told Madeline where she was and ended the call. She stood at the window with the empty coffee cup and looked at the city in full mourning, in full noise and motion, and thought about 30 months of careful architecture, and thought about the man in the unidentified meeting 4 weeks ago, and thought about the 2 captains Dario had named and what they were reporting upward and to whom. She thought about Roman sitting in the hotel with Celeste Arden and the cold knowledge, accumulating by the hour in the form of unanswered calls, that something he had thought he was choosing had been chosen for him. She thought about whether to tell him. It was the longest she spent on any single question that morning, and she had not resolved it by the time the knock came on the door, and this time it was not Dario. The man at the door was someone she recognized but had not spoken to in 3 years. A careful, thin-faced man named Oscar Brent, who had once served as a senior analyst for the Aldrich Network before, reportedly leaving that organization under ambiguous circumstances. He was standing in her corridor with his hands visible and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has calculated that this visit is necessary and is not certain how it will be received. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said, "I'm sorry for the intrusion. I need approximately 5 minutes. What I have to tell you cannot wait." He glanced down the corridor in both directions. "And it cannot wait because what I'm about to tell you changes everything you think you know about who is actually running this." She held the door open. He came in, and before she could speak, he set a single photograph on the table. A surveillance image, time-stamped 4 weeks ago, taken in a parking structure in Newark. And in it, she could see 2 men standing beside a dark car, and one of them she did not recognize, and one of them she recognized immediately with the absolute physical certainty of a woman looking at a face she had known for 22 years, and the face was not Roman's. The photograph was 4 inches by 6 inches, and it had been printed on standard paper, and it showed 2 men standing in the amber half-light of a parking structure at what the timestamp indicated was 11:22 in the evening 4 weeks ago Thursday, and the second man, the one she recognized, was Dario Mantovesi. Vivian did not move. She stood at the table with the photograph in front of her, and she did not pick it up, and she did not look away from it, and she did not speak, because there are moments when the body understands something before the mind has given it permission to, and the body's response in those moments is a kind of absolute stillness, the stillness of a system that has received information so structurally disruptive that it has temporarily suspended all non-essential functions while it attempts to determine whether what it is seeing is real. It was real. She knew Dario Mantovesi's posture the way she knew her own reflection, the angle of his shoulders, the way he held his hands, right slightly forward, left tucked at the hip, an old habit from years of carrying something on his left side that he no longer carried. The coat was his winter charcoal, the one with the slightly mismatched buttons that he'd never replaced because Dario was a man who noticed everything about other people and nothing about himself. Oscar Brent stood near the door with his hands still visible and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man delivering a diagnosis. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was level. She was aware of it being level in the way you are aware of a surface being level when you've just placed something very heavy on it and are watching to see if it holds. He sat. She remained standing. She moved to the window. She put her back to the photograph because she had seen it and did not need to keep looking at it, and needed instead to look at something that would not require her to manage her face. The city outside was fully awake. Traffic, a siren somewhere, a food cart operator on the corner below, arranging things with the methodical focus of a man who had done this exact thing every morning for years and expected to do it for many more. "How long have you had this?" she said. "The image was acquired 6 days ago," Brent said. "It took me 4 days to confirm what I was looking at, 2 days to decide what to do with it." "Who else has seen it?" "No one. I came here directly." She turned. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because I left the Aldrich Network 3 years ago, and the reason I left is the same reason I'm standing in this room at 7 in the morning with a photograph that could get me killed before noon. I don't work for the people who are running this. I work against them. Those are different things, and I need you to understand that before we continue." "Why should I?" "Because I've been inside their operation for 8 months. Not Aldrich, the layer above Aldrich, the coordination layer. The people that Stroud and Kellerman and the Aldrich Network all answer to without fully understanding that they answer to them." He leaned forward slightly. "This isn't a consortium of younger organizations seeing an opportunity, Ms. Ashcroft. That's the story they've been building for external consumption. What this actually is a single directional intelligence with significant capital, a 30-month operational timeline, and a specific objective that has nothing to do with territory. She waited. The objective, Brent said, is the council itself. Not the families, not the territories. The mediation and arbitration infrastructure that you built over 20 years, the back-channel relationships, the debt ledgers, the private agreements, the network of trust that keeps the alliance structure functional. They want to own it, not destroy it, own it. Because whoever controls the mechanism that keeps the criminal underworld from destroying itself controls everything that flows through that mechanism. He paused. And the only person who has ever controlled that mechanism is you. The room was very quiet. Dario, she said, has been their primary intelligence source inside the Viscari organization for approximately 18 months, Brent said. His access is comprehensive. Everything that moved through Roman's decision-making process. Every conversation you had with alliance partners that touched Viscari interests. Every piece of internal assessment. He stopped. He's also the one who identified the timing of Roman's Celeste situation and communicated it to the coordination layer. He didn't manufacture Roman's decision, but he manufactured the conditions that made it feel safe to act on. She thought about Dario sitting in the chair across from her 40 minutes ago. Dario with his hat on his knee and his careful voice and his legal pad and the two names he'd given her, the two Viscari captains he'd told her were compromised, the ones she'd told him to leave in place as windows. She thought about what he'd heard her say and what he was now doing with it. He was here, she said. I know. I was outside. Something moved in Brent's expression. I waited until he left. She pressed two fingers against the edge of the table and stood with the pressure of them there, a small physical anchor, something specific and solid, while the architecture of the last 20 hours reorganized itself inside her with the grinding structural quality of a building being demolished floor by floor from the top down. 22 years. She had worked alongside Dario Mantovese for 22 years. She had trusted his assessments with a completeness she had extended to almost no one, because Dario was meticulous and unglamorous and genuinely, she had believed, committed to the stability of the thing rather than the name above it. She had trusted him this morning. She had told him what she knew. She had told him what she needed. She had told him about the two captains and the channel and the window, and he had walked out of this room and gotten into an elevator and was right now, somewhere in this city, reporting everything she'd said. My phone, she said. Assume compromised. All of them. Personal, secure line, everything associated with this address. He reached into his coat and produced a disposable. Use this. The number inside the case is mine. She took it. She looked at it in her hand for a moment. A disposable phone in a hotel room in the West 40s, her wedding ring sitting on a white tablecloth in a ballroom she would never enter again. 22 years of careful architecture revealing a hidden structural failure so fundamental that she could not yet calculate how far it extended. The photograph, she said. The meeting in Newark. What was the conversation? Brent's jaw worked slightly. The final confirmation of the banquet timing and the delivery of a secondary instruction. He stopped. Tell me, if the banquet didn't produce the desired result, if you didn't leave, or if you left but the families didn't follow, the secondary instruction was a contingency for your removal by other means. He said it without softening it, which she appreciated. Dario argued against the contingency. That part is important. He drew a line at... He stopped again. At having me killed, she said. Yes. She absorbed this. She was not certain whether it made it better or worse. The knowledge that the man who had spent 22 years in her peripheral vision, who had sat across from her this morning with a second cup of coffee, and the expression of a man making a difficult and honest decision, had drawn a line at having her killed but had not drawn a line at anything else. She was not certain where exactly that line was supposed to exist on the spectrum of betrayal. She filed the uncertainty away for a time when she could afford to have it. What's the name? She said. The coordination layer. The single directional intelligence. Who is it? Brent looked at her steadily. That's the part that's going to be hardest to hear. I've had a hard morning. Say it. The operation is being run by a man named Garrison Aldrich, Brent said. Not the Aldrich network in general, Garrison specifically. The network is a front. He built it as a vehicle, and the people inside it believe they're working for their own interests. A pause. Garrison Aldrich was, until approximately 4 years ago, a silent partner in the financial infrastructure that supports the Vescari mediation accounts. He had access to the architecture of the trust network, not the relationships, but the financial plumbing, the accounts that held the debt ledgers, the accounts that funded the private resolutions. He stopped. He was introduced to that infrastructure by a person who trusted him, who vouched for him to Roman Viscari as a reliable, discreet financial intermediary. She already knew. She knew before he said it because the shape of the thing was now fully visible, and there was only one place this particular piece fit. Who vouched for him, she said. She said it anyway because she needed to hear it said. You did, Brent said, 8 years ago. You introduced Garrison Aldrich to the Vescari financial structure as a favor to an intermediary you trusted. You had no reason to doubt him. His credentials were legitimate, his discretion over the following 3 years was genuine, and by the time he began systematically using his access to map the full infrastructure, the relationship was too embedded to examine without raising the kind of questions that would have told him I was examining it, she said. Yes. She sat down. Not because she needed to, but because standing was no longer the right choice, and she was a woman who made correct choices even about small things, especially when everything large was in motion. She sat in the chair and put her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at them. Her hands, which she knew, which had not changed, which were still the same hands that had negotiated the Carucci debt restructuring and brokered the Moro ceasefire and prevented, over 2 decades, more destruction than she would ever be able to calculate. She had introduced Garrison Aldrich to the infrastructure that he had spent 4 years using to dismantle it. She had built the door he had walked through. He's going to move, she said. He's been waiting for the alliance structure to be destabilized. Last night gave him the opening. How fast? That's why I came this morning and not yesterday, Brent said. There's a meeting scheduled, not Newark. The coordination layer is convening with all 3 operational arms, Stroud, Kellerman, Aldrich's field people, at a location I have that is 40 minutes outside the city. The meeting is in 36 hours. Purpose. Final authorization for simultaneous territorial actions across 6 corridors. The calculation is that with the alliance structure in its current state, no seated mediation, Roman discredited, the families fragmented, there's no mechanism capable of organizing a coordinated response fast enough to stop 6 simultaneous moves. He paused. They're right about that. Under current conditions, they're correct. She looked at her hands on the table. 6 corridors simultaneously. The entire Eastern architecture coming apart at the same moment, each family dealing with its own emergency, none of them with the bandwidth or the trust to communicate laterally and organize a collective defense. The kind of destruction that would take a decade to undo, if it could be undone at all. The kind of chaos in which the coordination layer could step into the vacuum as the only entity with a comprehensive view, offering the mechanism of stability they had deliberately destroyed at a price. Her price. Her network. Her 22 years. Rebranded, repurposed, running under different ownership. She became aware of a sound from somewhere in the building. An elevator arriving, the distant metal sound of doors opening. She didn't know if it meant anything. She noted it. Where's Dario now? She said. He'll go back to Roman, Brent said. He needs to manage Roman's next moves. Specifically, he needs to make sure Roman doesn't do anything that accidentally stabilizes the situation before the 36-hour window closes. Which means he'll counsel Roman to escalate. Yes. And Roman will listen because Roman always listens to Dario when Dario tells him that strength is the answer. Yes. She stood up. The chair made a small sound against the floor. She moved to the window again. The same window. The same city, in its same magnificent indifference. And she thought with the rapid, compressed precision of someone who understands that she has a fixed amount of time and a specific set of variables, and that the combination of those things admits only a narrow range of responses. She thought about Felix Carucci and Vincent Moro and Madeline Croft, who were somewhere in the city waiting for her call. She thought about what she had told Dario, the 2 captains, the window, and what Dario had now given the coordination layer. She thought about Garrison Aldrich, A man she had met 8 years ago at a dinner in Boston, and whose handshake had been firm, and whose references had been impeccable, and who had, she now understood, been patient in a way that she recognized because it was the same quality she valued in herself, except that his patience had been directed at her specifically, at finding the seam in her judgment, at waiting for the moment she would extend trust to someone who had engineered the circumstance in which she would. She thought about the 36 hours. She thought about Dario walking out the door 40 minutes ago. And she thought about something Brent had said. Dario argued against the contingency. And she held that piece separately, turned it over, examined it from its edges, because in the rubble of everything she thought she'd known, this particular piece had a different texture. A man who participates in the dismantling of everything you built but draws a line at your death is not a man with a clean conscience. He is a man with a conscience that has been negotiating with itself for 18 months and has not yet resolved the negotiation. "I need to see Dario again," she said. Brent went still. "That's not as a source, not as an ally." She turned from the window. "I need to see him as the person who has the most to lose from what's about to happen and the least time left to choose which side of it he's on." She looked at Brent steadily. "He doesn't know you came to me. He doesn't know I have the photograph." Brent understood. She watched him understand it. "You want to use the window," he said, "the one you told him about." "I want to give him the chance to choose," she said, "once. And I want to see what he chooses. Because if he chooses correctly, he is the most valuable asset I have in the next 36 hours. And if he chooses incorrectly, I need to know that before I walk into a room with Madeline Croft and Vincent Morrow and ask them to trust me with their organization's survival." She crossed to the table and picked up the photograph. She held it. She looked at Dario's posture in the amber light of the parking structure and felt the loss of him. Not as an ally, not as an asset, but as the specific person he had been. The thin man with patient eyes who had not smiled genuinely in 12 years and who made 2 cups of coffee sometimes without being asked, because some habits operated beneath the level of calculation, even in men who had been calculating against you for 18 months. She allowed herself that. She allowed herself the loss of it, specifically, for approximately 15 seconds. Then she put the photograph in the inside pocket of her jacket. "Set up the meeting," she said, "with Dario. Tonight. Somewhere he'll come to without raising his guard. It has to read as me reaching out, not me pulling him in. He needs to believe he still has the information advantage." She looked at Brent. "Can you build that?" "I can build it," he said, "but I want to be clear about what you're doing. If Dario reports to the coordination layer that you're convening the families, they move the timeline. 36 hours becomes 12, maybe less." "I know. And if he doesn't choose correctly, then we are 12 hours from a coast-wide war and I have no inside channel to the operation running it," she said, "which is where we are right now anyway." She looked at him. "The difference is that if I play this correctly, I give Dario Mantovesi a reason to choose a side that hasn't yet done what the side he's been on has done. And men who have been negotiating with their own conscience for 18 months are sometimes looking for a reason. That's not sentiment, that's operational." Brent was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. "I'll need 2 hours to set it up properly. You have 90 minutes. He went to the door, paused. "Ms. Ashcroft, one more thing. The location of the coordination meeting, the one in 36 hours. He reached into his coat again and produced a folded paper, set it on the table. "I wasn't certain, when I walked in here this morning, whether you were going to be someone I could give that to. I'm more certain now." He left. She picked up the paper, unfolded it, looked at the address. She committed it to memory and then folded it again and put it with the photograph. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed. In through the nose, counted, out. The technique was not meditative. She had no patience for meditation. It was mechanical. It was the technique of a woman who had learned years ago that the mind's clarity was a function of the body's oxygen supply, and that before you made the next move in a situation like this one, you took 30 seconds and breathed correctly because the 30 seconds cost nothing and the alternative cost everything. The next move was Dario. But before Dario, there was a call she needed to make on Brent's disposable phone, Not to Madeline or Felix or Vincent, not yet. A call to a woman named Sylvie Crane, who had spent the last 3 years working as a forensic financial analyst for a private firm in Lower Manhattan, and who was, before she was any of those things, the person who had originally brought Garrison Aldrich's name to Vivian's attention 8 years ago as a reliable financial intermediary. Sylvie, who had vouched for the vouchsafe. Sylvie, who had never, in the 8 years since, given Vivian any reason to question the introduction. Sylvie, whose name Brent had not mentioned once during the entire conversation, despite the fact that if he had been inside the coordination layer's operation for 8 months, he would have encountered the origin of the Aldrich introduction and would have known it, and would have, unless he had a specific reason not to, mentioned it. Vivian stood with the disposable phone and thought about what it meant that Brent had not mentioned Sylvie Crane. She thought about patience, about 30-month timelines, about people who built careful approaches and waited for the moment when trust would be extended. She thought about a man arriving at her door at 7 in the morning with his hands visible in a photograph that confirmed the betrayal of the person she'd trusted most, arriving just after that person had left, creating a window of maximum impact, maximum disruption, maximum pressure on her to move quickly and in the direction the photograph implied. She thought about 36 hours and what could be accomplished in 36 hours by someone who needed her moving fast and in the wrong direction. She put the disposable phone down on the table and stood very still and felt the full cold weight of the possibility that Oscar Brent had just done to her, in the space of 45 minutes, exactly what Garrison Aldrich had done to her in the space of 8 years, except faster and under far greater time pressure, which meant that whoever was running this was not only patient, but adaptive, and that the photograph in her jacket pocket was either the most important piece of evidence she had or the most carefully manufactured piece of misdirection she had ever been handed, and she did not yet know which, and she had 90 minutes before Brent came back expecting her to have committed to a course of action. She stood in the middle of the room in the full morning light and understood, with the bone-deep clarity of a woman who had just had the floor removed from beneath her twice in 12 hours, that she was operating completely alone for the first time in 22 years. That every relationship she had trusted as load-bearing had just revealed a crack, and that the only intelligence she could fully rely on was her own, which meant that the next move could not be Dario, and could not be the disposable phone, and could not be anything that Oscar Brent expected her to do. The next move had to be the one that no one had planned for. She did not call Sylvie Crane. She did not use the disposable phone Brent had left her. She did not move toward any of the exits Brent would have mapped before he knocked on her door, because a man who had spent 8 months inside a coordination layer sophisticated enough to engineer a 30-month operation would have mapped the exits. She stood in the center of the room and she thought about what Oscar Brent had and had not said, and she thought about the photograph, and she thought about the 90 minutes she had told him he had, which meant he expected her to be preparing a specific set of moves during those 90 minutes, which meant the 90 minutes were the window she actually had. Not a deadline, but a clock running in her favor, as long as she used it for something other than what he expected. She went to the filing cabinet behind the false wall in the closet, the one that existed because 6 years ago she had furnished these rooms herself, over 3 weekends, with the help of no one. And she took from the bottom drawer a second phone, a clean one, registered to a name that had never appeared in any conversation she'd had in this room, or any other. She had 3 of these. She had never told Dario they existed. She had never told Roman. She had prepared them in the same spirit as the suite itself, not in anticipation of any specific event, but in recognition that a woman in her position should always have a door that only she had a key to. The first call she made was not to Felix Carucci or Madeline Croft or Vincent Morrow. It was to Sylvie Crane. Sylvie answered on the 3rd ring, voice still carrying the early morning thickness of someone pulled from sleep, and Vivian said, before anything else, "Tell me about the last time you spoke to Garrison Aldrich." A silence. Long enough to be a kind of answer. "Vivian, Sylvie, I need the truth in the next 30 seconds, or I need to stop having this conversation and start having a different one." Another silence, shorter. Then, 8 months ago. He reached out. He wanted to know if I still had contact with you. Sylvie's voice had changed. The sleep thickness was gone, and what replaced it was the tone of a woman who had been waiting for a specific call and had not known exactly when it would come. I told him no. I haven't spoken to you in 2 years, that's true. But he pushed. He wanted to know if there was any way to establish contact. I told him no again, and I ended the call. And I've been sitting on it ever since because I didn't know what it meant, and She stopped. I was afraid that bringing it to you would raise questions about why he'd called me, about the original introduction. Why did you introduce him to me? Because he paid me to, Sylvie said. It came out flat and immediate, the sound of a woman releasing something she'd been holding for 8 years. Not in cash, in debt forgiveness. I had a significant problem in 2016 and Garrison Aldrich resolved it, and the price was the introduction. I didn't know what he intended to do with the access. I didn't know until much later, and by then, her voice broke very slightly along one edge. By then, I was already inside it, and I didn't know how to come out. Vivian stood with the phone against her ear and felt the architecture shift again. Not collapse this time, but reconfigure. Sylvie was not the coordination layer's active asset. She was its original leverage point, converted 8 years ago and then sidelined, held in reserve the way you hold a card you might not need but cannot afford to discard. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Vivian said. No. Then, I'm sorry. I know, Vivian said. She ended the call. She had what she needed, which was confirmation that the photograph of Dario was real. Brent had not manufactured it as misdirection. He had withheld Sylvie's name because Sylvie's name was a vulnerability in his own sourcing chain, not because Sylvie was an active piece. The photograph was what it was. Dario was what he was. She had 45 minutes left of the 90. She called Felix Carucci. I need all of you, she said when he answered. Morrow, Croft, Theodorus. The Meridian, 40 minutes. Private entrance. Tell no one else, and I mean that specifically. Do not use any channel that has touched a Vescari line in the last 24 hours. What happened? I'll tell you when I see you. She paused. Felix, bring your father. He's 80 years old. I know. Bring him. She ended the call. She took the photograph from her jacket pocket and looked at it one more time. Then she folded it precisely and put it back. She thought about Dario for exactly the amount of time she could afford, which was the length of time it took to button her coat. 4 buttons, 4 seconds. She thought about 22 years and a man with patient eyes and the way he had looked at her this morning across the coffee cups, with the expression of someone making an honest decision, which was a performance she now understood, but which had also, she recognized with the clarity of someone who has no more room for comfortable lies, contained something real. Because Dario had drawn the line. He had argued against the contingency. He had sat across from her this morning and told her 2 names, and she had told him to use them as a window, and he had walked out of here with that information and then had not, in the 45 minutes since, moved against her. She would not call him. She would not warn him. She would not give him the chance he had not given her. But she would note it, because the landscape she was navigating in the next 36 hours required that she have an accurate map of every person in it, and Dario Mantovesi on that map was not an enemy. He was something more complicated and less useful, which was a man who had made terrible choices for reasons she could not yet fully see, and who had, at the bottom of his terrible choices, drawn one line and held it. She left through the service corridor at the back of the building. The Meridian was 18 blocks north. She walked it. She needed the air, and she needed the movement, and she needed the 18 blocks of sidewalk and traffic noise, and the specific anonymity of a city that held several million people and didn't care about any of them, because she needed to arrive at that meeting having already processed what she was about to say, which was going to be the hardest thing she'd said to anyone since she walked out of the Sovereign Ballroom the night before. She arrived with 3 minutes to spare. The private entrance at the Meridian was a corridor off the loading dock that led to a service elevator that accessed the 8th floor without touching the lobby. She had used it once before, 7 years ago, for a meeting that had prevented a situation she had never fully explained to Roman because Roman would have responded to the explanation by making the situation worse. The room was a standard conference setup: table, chairs, no windows. Felix had arranged it. Don Salvatore Carucci was already seated when she entered, which meant Felix had moved fast and the old man had moved with him, which told her what she needed to know about where they were. Salvatore was frail in the way of men whose minds have not followed their bodies into decline. Sharp-eyed, upright in the chair with a deliberateness that cost him something, wearing a suit that had been pressed this morning by someone who still pressed his suits every morning out of habit and loyalty. He looked at her when she came in the way he'd looked at her in the ballroom before dinner, the look of a man confirming something he'd already assessed. Vincent Morrow was standing at the far wall. He nodded once. Madeline Croft was at the table with a notepad in front of her that was already half filled, which meant she'd been working since their call. Theodorus was near the door, which was where Gus Theodorus always positioned himself, a man who had survived 30 years in the independent corridor by maintaining proximity to exits. She did not sit. She stood at the head of the table, and she told them. Not everything. There wasn't time for everything, and they didn't need everything. They needed what was operational. She told them about the 30-month timeline. She told them about the 6-corridor simultaneous action. She told them about the coordination layer in Garrison Aldrich, and the fact that the infrastructure being used to dismantle the alliance structure was built on financial access that had been inside the Viscari mediation accounts for 4 years. She told them about the 36-hour window and the meeting location that was now in her jacket pocket next to the photograph. She did not tell them about the photograph. She did not tell them about Dario. She did not tell them about Brent. Not yet, because Brent was a variable she hadn't fully resolved, and she would not hand an unresolved variable to a room full of people who were about to make decisions based on what she told them. When she finished, the room was quiet. Don Salvatore spoke first. His voice was thin, but it carried. The financial access, the mediation accounts. How much does Aldrich know about the structure? Enough to know where every significant private agreement is documented, she said. Enough to replicate the administrative function if he controls the relationships. But he doesn't control the relationships, Salvatore said. He was looking at her with that flat, confirming look. Those are yours. They are. Then he needs you at the table, Salvatore said, alive and functional. Or he needs a version of this infrastructure that he can convince the families to accept instead of you, which means... He stopped, looked at the table. Which means the 6-corridor action is not a conquest. It's a demonstration. He creates a crisis and then arrives with the solution. The solution is the mediation infrastructure under his control. And the families, in the aftermath of simultaneous territorial attacks, accept it because the alternative is continued chaos. The room processed this. Madeline set her pen down. He's not taking over the underworld, Madeline said. He's taking over the mechanism that keeps it from destroying itself, which is worth more. She looked at Vivian. And the only thing standing between him and that mechanism is you being unwilling to sit at his table. Yes, Vivian said, so the contingency is still on the table, Vivian said. Regardless of what his internal debate produced, if I become a problem rather than a resource, the calculation changes. Vincent Morrow finally spoke from his position at the wall. The meeting location, the one in 36 hours. His voice was flat and direct. You're thinking about the meeting. I'm thinking about what we do before the meeting, she said, and what we do at it. We don't have the personnel to, Felix started. We're not sending personnel, she said. Not in the way you're thinking. She looked around the table. If we send armed response to a location where Stroud, Kellerman, and Aldrich's operational leadership are convening, 3 things happen. First, we tip them that we have inside intelligence, and they identify and eliminate the source, which closes our window permanently. Second, we escalate before any of the 6-corridor actions have actually begun, which means we have no legal or documentary justification for what follows. Third, and this is the one that matters most, we confirm for every family not in this room that the old Alliance leadership responds to complex situations the way Roman responds to complex situations, which is with force before understanding, and we lose the moral architecture that is the only thing distinguishing us from the operation we're trying to stop. The room was quiet again. Then what? Morrow said. We go to the meeting, Vivian said. I go to the meeting. The silence had a different quality now. Vivian, Madeline said, not as a target, not as a supplicant, as the only person in the room that everyone present needs to be in a room with. She put her hands flat on the table. Garrison Aldrich has spent 30 months building toward a moment where he controls the mechanism. The mechanism only has value because of the relationships. The relationships only exist because of me. If I walk into that meeting with full documentation of his operation, the 30-month timeline, the financial access, the manufactured signals, the coordinated external pressure, and I present that documentation in front of every operational leader of every arm of his network simultaneously, I remove his ability to compartmentalize. Stroud won't know what Kellerman was promised. Kellerman won't know what Stroud's arrangement looked like. Neither of them will know the full structure of how they were used. When they see it laid out, they turn on him, Felix said. They turn on each other first, she said, and then on him, because the one thing that organizations like Stroud and Kellerman and the Aldrich field operation have in common is that they entered this arrangement believing they were principals. The moment they understand they were instruments and that the instruments are disposable once the mechanism is in place. She stopped. Let them finish the calculation. They're not going to let you walk into that room with documentation, Morrow said. They'll have security. Yes. And you're proposing to walk in anyway. I'm proposing to walk in as if I'm considering his offer, she said. As if the events of the last 24 hours have made me open to a different arrangement. As if a woman who just had everything taken from her might be looking for a table that still has a chair with her name on it. She looked at Morrow steadily. I need them to believe that for long enough to get the documentation in front of the right people. And after that, Madeline said quietly. After that, it's out of my hands, Vivian said, which is where I need it to be. Don Salvatore made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You're going to walk into a room with 3 criminal organizations and the man who spent 2.5 years dismantling your life, he said, and you're going to do it alone. Not entirely, she said. She reached into her jacket and produced not the photograph but the folded paper with the meeting location. She set it on the table. I need someone outside. Multiple somebodies, not armed response, documentation. I need everything that happens in that building recorded. I need chain of custody that will survive scrutiny. And I need it delivered to 3 specific addresses within 1 hour of the meeting's conclusion, regardless of what happens to me inside. The room was very still. Felix Carucci looked at his father. Don Salvatore looked at Vivienne with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize, without sentimentality, the specific quality of a person who has made a decision and is no longer negotiating with themselves about it. What are the 3 addresses? Salvatore said. She told them. 2 were law enforcement contacts she had maintained for 11 years. Not corrupt ones, clean ones. People who had been recipients of specific information at specific times, and who had, over 11 years, developed a clear-eyed understanding of who was providing the information and why it was reliable and what it would mean when it arrived. The 3rd address was a journalist at a national publication who had been sitting on a significant and documented story about the financial infrastructure of the Eastern Criminal Network for 3 years, waiting for the last piece that would make it bulletproof. 3 addresses, Madeline said. Law enforcement? Media? She paused. You're not just stopping the operation. No, Vivian said. You're ending the whole structure, Madeline said, the way it currently exists. The way it currently exists is what Garrison Aldrich was able to attack for 30 months without anyone seeing it, Vivian said. The way it currently exists put 300 people in a room last night where one man's ego was the primary load-bearing element. The way it currently exists required one woman to quietly carry the weight of all of it for 22 years with no accountability in either direction. She looked around the table. I'm not destroying the structure. I'm removing the part of it that was always going to fail. The meeting ended 20 minutes later with 4 commitments and a detailed operational plan for the 36-hour window. Felix would handle the documentation team outside the meeting location. Madeline would coordinate the delivery chain to the 3 addresses. Morrow would manage the internal communication to the family heads not present. Not a full briefing, enough to ensure they didn't take destabilizing action in the interim. Theodorus, who had said almost nothing during the meeting, but who had the specific quality of a man who processes quickly and acts precisely, would handle something Vivian had asked him for privately as the room was clearing, a request she had not made in front of the others because it concerned a piece of the operation she was not yet ready to share. She was the last to leave. Don Salvatore was being helped with his coat by Felix, and he caught her arm as she passed, not restraining, just the hand of a very old man making contact with the specific deliberateness of someone who does not take the gesture for granted. "My wife," he said. "When she died, I asked her, at the end, if she had regrets." His voice was thin and even. She said the only thing she regretted was the years she spent making herself smaller than she was so that I would feel large enough. He looked at her. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. Vivian looked at him. "Don't be small tonight," he said. He released her arm. She left. The next 31 hours were the most precise of her life. She did not return to the Ashford Arms. She did not return to the West 40s suite. She moved through the city in a pattern that had no fixed center, using the clean phone and 2 additional lines she established before noon, and she built the documentation package with the methodical attention of a woman who understood that what she was assembling was not a weapon but a record, and that the difference mattered because a weapon could be turned against you. But a record simply was. She called in favors she had been holding for years, not the kind of favors that require explanation, the kind that require only a name, a date, and a specific encrypted file transfer to a specific address. She had those files. She had maintained them the way she maintained the secret suite and the clean phones, not in anticipation of any specific disaster, but in recognition that a woman in her position should always be able to prove what she knows. Oscar Brent returned to the West 40s suite at the appointed time and found it empty. She did not contact him. She assessed him as a 40% probability of being a genuine defector and a 60% probability of something more complicated, and 40% was not sufficient basis for the kind of trust the next 18 hours required. If he was genuine, he would find his way to the right side of this through other means. If he wasn't, her absence from the suite was its own message. At 9 o'clock that evening, she received a call on the clean phone from a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "It's Dario," he said. She said nothing. "I know you know," he said. His voice was different from this morning. The careful, structured quality was gone, and what was underneath it was older and more damaged. "I don't know how, but I know you know, and I need you to know that the contingency, I stopped it. I stopped it twice. The second time was this afternoon." A pause. "They wanted to move the timeline. I told them the move would be counterproductive. I bought you time that I can't—" He stopped. "I can't keep buying. They're going to move at midnight tomorrow regardless. The meeting location has changed. I'm sending you the new address right now." She waited. The address came through as a text to the clean phone number she had not given him, which meant he had other resources and had used them to find her, which was either evidence of sincerity or evidence of a more sophisticated play than she had attributed to the coordination layer. "Dario," she said. "Yeah." "Why?" A long silence. "Because I've been doing something I can't explain for 18 months, he said. "And the only explanation I can offer is that it started as something I thought I could manage, and it became something else, and by the time I understood what it had become, I was inside it in ways that didn't have clean exits." Another pause. "And because this morning, in that room, when you said window, I understood that you still trusted me enough to tell me your strategy, and I've been sitting with that all day and I can't—" His voice broke along a single edge. "I can't be the reason this ends the way it's going to end if I do nothing." She looked at the address on the screen, a harbor location, 40 minutes south of the city. "The harbor," she said. "That's where they're convening." "Yes, everything moves up. The 6 corridors activate at midnight, simultaneous with the meeting. They need the meeting to happen before the actions begin so they can coordinate the response offer in real time." A pause. "Vivian, there's something else. Garrison Aldrich is not the top of this. There's a name above his that you don't have." She went very still. "I'll give you the name," Dario said, "but I need to be in the room when you use it. I need to be able to—" He stopped. I need to be able to choose the right side in front of the right people, not for myself. Because the name means nothing without confirmation, and I'm the only confirmation that exists. She held the phone and thought for exactly 4 seconds. The harbor location, she said. Be there an hour before the meeting. Come alone. Yes. And Dario. Yeah. If this is the last play, she said, make it clean. She ended the call and stood in the darkness of the parking structure where she'd taken the call. A different parking structure than the one in the photograph, but the amber light was the same quality, the same half-dark, and she was aware of the symmetry without being moved by it. The meeting was in 27 hours. Now 23, with the new timeline. She called Felix Carucci and gave him the new address and told him the timeline had compressed and that the documentation team needed to be in position by 11. She called Madeline and updated the delivery chain. She called the number Theodorus had given her and confirmed the thing she'd asked him for, which he confirmed in 4 words and then ended the call, because Theodorus was the kind of man who understood that the 4 words were sufficient. She stood in the parking structure and breathed. In, counted, out. Tomorrow night she was going to walk into a warehouse on the harbor with a documentation package, a compromised ally, and the name of a person she didn't yet know. And she was going to stand in a room full of people who had spent 30 months engineering her removal, and she was going to end what they had built using the only tools she had ever actually had, which were a clear record of the truth and the willingness to speak it in the presence of the people it implicated. She had done harder things. She could not, at this exact moment, think of one. The harbor was dark and cold when Felix's car dropped her at the perimeter of the old Crestline Maritime facility at 11:47 the following night, 47 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, and the lights inside the main warehouse were already burning yellow through the high windows, and there were shapes moving on the roof that she identified as snipers before the car had fully stopped, and the shapes on the ground near the secondary entrance were armed and alert, and there were more of them than she had expected. And she stood outside the car in the cold harbor air and looked at the building and felt her heart doing what hearts do when the body finally understands that the calculation is real and the variables are live and there is no longer any distance between the plan and the thing itself. Behind her, from inside the facility's outer perimeter, a figure stepped from the shadows. Dario. He looked like a man who had not slept in 2 days and had spent those days reaching a decision that had cost him the version of himself he'd been for the last 18 months. He stopped 10 feet from her and stood in the amber security light, and they looked at each other in the particular silence of 2 people who have 22 years between them and are about to walk into a building together knowing that the walkout will be different for at least one of them. The name, she said. Give it to me now, before we go in. He told her. She heard it. She absorbed it. She did not let it show on her face because what showed on her face in the next 30 seconds would determine whether she walked into the warehouse with the composure the next hour required, and she was not going to let a name, even this particular and devastating name, take that from her. She breathed. In, counted, out. All right, she said. She walked toward the warehouse doors. Dario fell into step beside her, and the doors opened before they reached them, and the warehouse interior opened around them, massive, cold, smelling of salt water and machine oil and the particular tension of a room full of armed people who have been waiting. And at the far end of the space, at a table under the hanging industrial lights, 4 men were seated, and the 4th man, the one she had not expected, the one whose name Dario had given her 60 seconds ago in the harbor dark, looked up at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this particular confrontation for a very long time and is not certain, now that it has arrived, that he was as prepared for it as he believed. The 4th man was Roman Vescari. She did not stop walking. That was the first thing, the thing that cost her more than anything else in the next 4 seconds, which were the 4 seconds between seeing Roman's face and reaching the center of the warehouse floor, 4 seconds in which her body wanted to stop and her mind overruled it because stopping was the signal they were waiting for. Stopping was the confirmation that the name had done what names like that are designed to do, which is remove a person's capacity to continue forward. She continued forward. The warehouse was vast and cold and smelled of salt water and old machinery and the specific metallic underscent of weapons that have been handled recently. The industrial lights hung on chains from the ceiling 30 feet above, casting the kind of illumination that creates hard shadows and leaves the edges of a space in genuine darkness. And in those edges she could identify, without looking directly at them, the shapes of armed personnel. Not the ones on the roof, different ones, interior, positioned at intervals along the walls with the spacing of people who had been placed by someone who understood sightlines. At the table under the central light sat 4 men. Garrison Aldrich she recognized from their single meeting 8 years ago. He had aged in the way of men whose internal tension is chronic, which is to say that he appeared to have compacted rather than expanded, as if the years had pressed him denser rather than marking him with the usual evidence of time. He was 60 or close to it, with the kind of stillness that is not calm but containment, and he was watching her walk toward him with the expression of a man who had run this scenario many times in his planning and is now calculating the difference between the simulation and the real. To Aldrich's left sat a man she identified as the field commander of the Aldrich Network's operational arm, a figure named Breslin, whose face she knew from Brent's briefing and whose presence confirmed that this was not a strategic meeting but a full operational convening. To Aldrich's right was a man from the Kellerman organization, whose name she didn't have, but whose posture communicated seniority. And at the end of the table, in a chair that was slightly separated from the other 3 in a way that might have been accidental and was not, sat Roman Viscari. He was wearing the same charcoal he'd worn to the sovereign's banquet. He had not changed. The coat was slightly rumpled at the shoulders, and his tie was loosened by exactly the amount a man loosens his tie when he has been sitting in a difficult situation for several hours, and the difficulty has begun to manifest physically. He looked, Vivian thought, like a man who had been told a story that seemed to explain everything and had accepted it, and has only now, looking at the person the story was about, begun to feel the edges of the story where it didn't fit. He did not look like the architect of a 30-month operation. He looked like a man who had been used. She reached the center of the floor and stopped. Dario stopped 2 paces behind her and to her left. She was aware of his breathing, slightly elevated, controlled, the breathing of a man managing fear rather than absent of it. Garrison Aldrich rose from his chair. He did it with the particular deliberateness of a man who has waited a long time for a specific moment and intends to conduct himself within it precisely. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said, "I'm glad you came." "You knew I would," she said. "I hoped," just a slight adjustment in his expression that was not quite a smile. Hoping and knowing are different things. That distinction is something I've learned to respect. She looked past him to Roman. Roman met her eyes and held them for longer than 2 seconds this time. She noted that. The Roman Viscari she had left in the Sovereign Ballroom 48 hours ago was a man who looked away. The Roman Viscari sitting at this table in a harbor warehouse at midnight was a man looking at her the way a man looks at something he has just understood that he does not understand. "Roman," she said. Not a question. "Vivian." His voice was rough in a way it hadn't been in years, rough the way voices get when they've been through a conversation that has cost the speaker something significant. "I didn't know you were—" He stopped, looked at Aldrich. "He didn't tell me you were coming." "No?" Aldrich said easily, returning to his chair. "I didn't." He looked at Vivian. "Please sit." "I'll stand," she said. He accepted this. "Let me be direct. The events of the last 48 hours have created a situation that is, depending on how the next hour proceeds, either catastrophic or transformative. The alliance structure as it existed is no longer functional. The families are fragmented. The mediation infrastructure has no seated authority. In approximately, he glanced at the watch on his left wrist. 53 minutes, certain territorial actions will begin across 6 corridors that will accelerate that fragmentation considerably. He paused. "Unless they don't." "Unless you call them off," she said. "Unless we reach an arrangement that makes calling them off rational," he said. "The actions are a demonstration of capacity, Ms. Ashcroft. They were never the objective. The objective is a restructured mediation and arbitration framework for the Eastern Network, properly capitalized, properly administered, with the relationships and the trust infrastructure that you have built over 20 years as its foundation." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not your enemy. I'm the person who understood the value of what you built before you understood it yourself. I want to preserve it. Under your control, she said. Under a shared structure, he said, with you at its operational center, where you have always been. The difference is that the structure would be properly resourced, properly protected, and no longer dependent on the goodwill of a single man whose goodwill proved to be conditional. He didn't look at Roman when he said it, which was its own form of looking. Roman's jaw tightened. He said nothing. She looked at Aldrich. You spent 30 months dismantling the foundation of the alliance structure. You manufactured instability across 6 corridors. You placed an asset inside the Viscari organization for 18 months. You used Garrison Aldrich's name, your name, as a false front for a coordination layer that none of the organizations you recruited have full visibility into. She paused. And you used a man I trusted to remove me from my position on the same night you needed the alliance structure to be maximally vulnerable. She paused. And you're describing this as wanting to preserve what I built. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Necessary architecture, he said. The existing structure would not have accepted a new framework without evidence that the existing one was insufficient. I created that evidence. You created a war. I created the conditions for a war that I am offering to prevent, he said. He said it without apology and without embarrassment, in the tone of a man who has a coherent internal logic and expects it to be recognized as such. The distinction matters. The distinction, she said, is the same distinction you just made between hoping and knowing. You think they're different things. In this case, they aren't. She reached into her jacket. Every armed figure in the warehouse periphery moved. Small movements, adjustments, the subtle shift of people whose hands have been near weapons and have just received a signal from the environment to be closer to them. She was aware of it along her back and the back of her neck. She moved slowly, and she produced not a weapon, but a folded document, and she set it on the floor of the warehouse in front of her because there was no table within reach, and she was not going to cross the remaining distance to Aldrich's table to hand it to him, and she stepped back. That's a summary, she said. 30 months of operational activity, financial transfers, personnel placements, communications intercepts, and a detailed map of the coordination layer including the names of every figure who participated, every organization that was recruited, and the specific nature of the arrangements each of them were offered. She looked at Aldrich. The full documentation is not in this building. Copies of it are currently in transit to 3 addresses. The transit is not contingent on what happens in this room. It cannot be stopped. She paused. The first address is a federal law enforcement contact with whom I have worked for 11 years, and who has the context to understand what they're receiving. The second address is similar. The third is a journalist. The room was silent. The Kellerman figure had gone very still. Breslin, the field commander, was looking at Aldrich with an expression that had shifted from the flat attention of a subordinate to something that contained the first edges of self-interest calculation. Aldrich looked at the document on the warehouse floor. He did not pick it up. The transit, he said, you're certain it can't be stopped. The people carrying it don't know where they're going until they're already there, she said, and the people receiving it were notified an hour ago to expect something time-sensitive and to treat any interruption of their evening as itself informative. A silence. You walked in here, Aldrich said slowly, with nothing to offer and a documentation package that destroys everyone in this room regardless of what I agree to. I walked in here, she said, with a choice for you. The documentation as it currently exists implicates the coordination layer. It implicates the recruited organizations. It implicates the financial infrastructure and the asset placements and the manufactured instability. She looked at him steadily. It doesn't yet include the identity of the person at the top of the coordination layer, the person above you, the person whose capital funded the 30-month operation and whose name you've been careful to keep out of every document trail. She paused. That name is in this room tonight. I have it, and whether it goes into the documentation package or not depends on what you do in the next 10 minutes. Aldrich went very still. Breslin stood up from his chair. Sit down, Vivian said to Breslin, without looking at him, in a tone that had no heat in it and no threat, but which carried the specific quality of a woman accustomed to being obeyed in rooms she didn't own. Breslin sat down. She looked at Aldrich. Call them off. All 6 corridors. Right now, from this room, using whatever channel you use to communicate with your field operations. And then you and I are going to spend the next hour in this building with the people you recruited, and we are going to show them the documentation and explain to them in detail how they were used. Not as principles, as instruments. And at the end of that hour, every organization in this room is going to make a decision about what it does next, and that decision is going to be its own, made with full information, which is the thing you denied them when you recruited them. She paused. That's the offer. And the name above me, Aldrich said. Goes to the same federal contact, she said, but separately, on a timeline that gives you enough distance that your cooperation tonight is on record first. She held his eyes. I'm not offering you safety. I'm offering you the difference between what happens to you if you cooperate and what happens to you if you don't. A long silence. Roman Vescari pushed back his chair and stood up. He stood at the end of the table with his hands at his sides and his tie loosened and the rumpled shoulders of his coat, and he looked across the warehouse floor at Vivian with the expression she had been waiting 48 hours to see. Not the arrogance of the sovereign ballroom and not the calculation of the harbor table, but something older and more honest that she recognized from a hotel corridor in Boston 22 years ago when he had been a younger man who had not yet learned to confuse the things he controlled with the things he had earned. How long? He said. She understood the question. I've known about the access to the financial accounts for approximately 12 hours, she said. I've known that the banquet was manufactured for 48. No. He shook his head slightly. How long did you know that I was a... He stopped. The word he was looking for was instrument, and he knew it and could not say it. I didn't know, she said. I thought you chose it. The distinction landed on him visibly, in the way that a specific truth lands differently than a general one, because it addresses the exact shape of the wound rather than its general location. He had not been weak. He had been targeted. The man who built the Viscari syndicate from nothing had been assessed by someone with patience and resources and a comprehensive understanding of his psychology, and had been given, at precisely the right moment, the conditions in which he would do the thing he had always wanted to do, and he had done it. And it had been used, and the using of it had cost him everything. The doing of it was supposed to have gained. Roman sat back down. He did not speak again for a long time. Garrison Aldrich looked at the document on the warehouse floor for what felt like a full minute. Then he reached into his coat and produced a phone and made a call and said 4 words into it, and the 4 words were enough, and he ended the call and set the phone on the table. It's done, he said. The 6 corridors stand down. He looked at her. Now what? Now we finish it, she said. What followed was not dramatic in the way that the events preceding it had been dramatic. It was methodical. It was the kind of work that is invisible until it's complete, the kind that requires patience and precision and the willingness to stay in a room long after the adrenaline has cleared, and what remains is the grinding, necessary labor of accounting. Vivian spent the next 90 minutes in the Crestline warehouse doing what she had spent 22 years doing in rooms that looked nothing like a cold harbor building at midnight. She managed the aftermath of a crisis using the only tools she had ever actually possessed, which were clarity and the capacity to make other people see what was in front of them. She showed Breslin the documentation. She showed it to the Kellerman representative. She walked them through the 30-month timeline in specific detail, the approach to their organizations, the arrangements they had been offered, the things they had been told about the other organizations, the things those other organizations had been told about them, and the ways in which the information shared with each of them had been curated to make the arrangement seem exclusive and the objectives seem aligned when they were neither. Breslin's face moved through several phases. The Kellerman figure sat in a particular stillness that Vivian recognized as the stillness of a man running a rapid internal calculation about liability and exposure, and the difference between being a documented participant in a conspiracy and being a documented participant who cooperated before the documentation became public. Neither of them would face clean outcomes. She had not promised clean outcomes. She had promised honest information and a record of their behavior in this room, and she was providing both. At 1:40 in the morning, Felix Carucci sent a confirmation to the clean phone. Documentation delivered to all 3 addresses, received and acknowledged. She showed the confirmation to Aldrich without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. Something in his face, which had maintained its composure through the previous 90 minutes with the discipline she recognized as genuine, finally released, not into anger or despair, but into something that was almost, in its flatness, close to relief. The relief of a man who has been maintaining a very complex structure for a very long time and has now been relieved of the obligation of maintaining it. "The name," he said. "The one above me." She looked at him. "It's already in the supplemental package," she said. "It went to the federal contacts separately. It arrived 20 minutes ago." He absorbed this. "You never intended to use it as leverage." "I intended to tell the truth about it," she said. "Which is what I said." He was quiet. "You're a precise person." "Yes," she said. He was processed by federal authorities 6 days later. Breslin cooperated before the week was out. The Kellerman representative retained counsel within the hour and began a conversation that would ultimately produce significant documentary corroboration of the coordination layer's operational structure. The name above Garrison Aldrich, a financier with legitimate public credentials and a 30-year history of invisible involvement in the Eastern criminal infrastructure, was the subject of an investigation that took 14 months to conclude and concluded decisively. But that night, the thing that mattered happened in the warehouse before any of that. In the last 15 minutes before the people with authority to take formal action arrived, in the space that Vivian had asked Felix to give her before the room became official. The space was for Roman. She crossed the warehouse floor to the table where he was sitting. She sat down across from him for the first time that night. The industrial lights above them made the shadows fall at angles that weren't kind to either of them, and she was aware of what she looked like. The coat she'd worn for 2 days, the lines of the last 48 hours visible in the way lines get visible when you've stopped managing them. And she didn't manage them now. Roman looked at her across the table. He looked like a man who has been at the bottom of something and has not yet been able to confirm whether the bottom is the lowest point or just a landing on the way further down. "I thought it was my idea," he said. "I know. He found me 4 weeks ago, a meeting I thought I arranged." He shook his head slightly. "He agreed with everything I said. He validated everything I'd been thinking for a long time. About you. About the balance of things. About how it should be." His voice was low and even, and without self-pity, which was, she thought, perhaps the most honest she had heard him speak in years. "I believed him because he was saying things I already believed." "That's how it works," she said. "I humiliated you in front of every person who mattered," he said, "in the room where it would do the most damage. And I did it because someone handed me a reason, and I took it." He looked at her. "Because I wanted the reason. I'd been wanting it for a long time." She held his eyes. "You wanted credit," she said, "not as an accusation, as a fact." "I wanted to be the reason," he said. "Not half the reason, not the visible half while you were the—" He stopped. "I built something real. From nothing. I know that." "You did," she said. "But I looked at the room at the end of every year," he said, "and I could see them looking at you, and I could see that it wasn't—" He stopped again. "It wasn't fear. What they had for you. It wasn't what they had for me." "No," she said, "and I couldn't—" He put his hands flat on the table. His hands were thick and scarred at the knuckles, and she had known them for 22 years. "I couldn't figure out how to have that, what you had. I could make people afraid. I couldn't make them—" He shook his head. "Trust," she said. "Yeah." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the warehouse, she could hear the harbor, water against the pilings, the distant sound of something large moving slowly through the dark. "You could have told me," she said. "Any of the 22 years." "No," he said. "I couldn't, because telling you would have been admitting it. And admitting it would have meant that everything I—" He stopped. "A man doesn't easily say to his wife, the thing that keeps this together isn't me." "A man doesn't have to say it," she said. "He just has to not destroy it." Roman looked at the table. "No," he said. "He does. He does have to say it. Because if he doesn't, it eats at him until he does what I did, which is find someone who will tell him it isn't true." He was quiet for a moment. Garrison Aldrich told me what I wanted to hear, and I walked into a room with 300 people and I burned everything because someone told me it was the right match to light. The voices at the warehouse entrance were getting closer. Felix's voice, another she recognized as belonging to someone official, the productive sounds of an aftermath assembling itself. She had perhaps 4 more minutes in this warehouse as a private space. Celeste, she said. Something moved in Roman's face. She left this morning. He shook his head. She was 29 years old and she got in over her head. She didn't know what she was part of. He paused. Neither did I, but I was supposed to. Yes, Vivian said. You were. He looked at her. What happens now? You cooperate with the people who are about to come through that door, she said. Fully, specifically, without condition. Everything Aldrich told you, everything you told him, every communication, every meeting, you give them all of it. And then you spend a significant portion of time in a room with lawyers determining the nature of your personal exposure, and you deal with that exposure honestly. She paused. And when it's over, when all of it is over, you will have given something back. To who? To the people who had to spend 22 years living inside whatever you built, she said, by not making it worse in the aftermath. He was quiet. He put his hands in his lap and looked at them. And you? She stood up. She looked at him from standing. At this man she had spent 22 years beside, who had built something real from nothing and then spent 22 years being afraid that the something real wasn't enough, who had been targeted because his fear was visible to someone with the patience to exploit it, who had done a terrible thing and had also been made into an instrument of someone else's terrible thing, and the two facts coexisted without canceling each other, and she held both of them, and she felt what she felt about both of them, and she did not perform either grief or hardness. I'm going to build something better, she said. Not bigger, better. She walked toward the entrance. At the doors, Dario Mantovese was standing. He had been standing near the wall for the last 90 minutes, present and quiet, doing the thing that she had asked him to do that night without using words, which was witness. He was the record. He had been the record. Not a sympathetic one, not a clean one, but an accurate one. And accuracy was what she had needed in this room, and he had provided it. He looked at her as she approached. His face was the face of a man who has made a decision that resolved an 18-month negotiation with himself and who is living now in the first moments of whatever comes after that resolution and does not yet know what that is. She stopped in front of him. You stopped the contingency twice, she said. Yes. And you called me last night. Yes. And you were in the room tonight for everything. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment, at the thin face with the patient eyes that had, she now knew, been patient in service of 2 different things simultaneously for 18 months. She thought about what that cost. She thought about the kinds of internal negotiation that produce a man who participates in the dismantling of something he values because he has been placed in a position where the alternative is not clear, and she thought about where the line was between that and something she could not name and did not need to name tonight. You'll have to account for what you did, she said. I know. All of it. To the right people in the right detail. Yes. And after that, she paused. I don't know what after that looks like. I can't tell you. I don't have enough yet. He nodded once. It was not the nod of a man expecting absolution. It was the nod of a man who understands that accountability is not a transaction, and that some things require time to become clear, and that the best available posture in the meantime is honest presence. She walked past him and through the doors. The harbor air hit her again, cold and salt and the dark water smell of a place that has existed for longer than any particular human drama being conducted on its edge. Felix was there, and behind him 2 figures she recognized from 11 years of careful cultivation. It was handled. It was being handled. She walked past the warehouse to the edge of the dock and stood there for a moment. The water was very dark and very quiet. Behind her, the sounds of the aftermath, official voices, car doors, the administrative machinery of consequence, continued in the amber light spilling from the warehouse doors. She was 53 years old. She had spent 22 years in a structure that had been, she now understood with the clarity of someone who has seen it from the outside for the first time, too dependent on her willingness to be invisible. Not just Roman's willingness to accept that invisibility, her own. She had been good at the work. She had chosen it genuinely for reasons that were real. But she had also permitted the invisibility because it was easier than the alternative, which was claiming credit in a room full of people who would have required her to fight for it. She had never wanted to fight for credit. She had wanted to do the work. She could still do the work. 3 weeks later, in a private estate in Westchester that belonged to no family and was held in the name of a trust that Vivian had structured and registered in the months following the Crestline night, the first formal meeting of what would come to be called the Ashcroft Council took place. There were 9 people in the room. Not all of them had clean histories. Not all of them represented organizations that had no blood on their hands. She had not set cleanliness as the criterion. She had set willingness to operate within a mediation framework as the criterion, and willingness to be accountable to that framework when disputes arose, and willingness to accept that the mechanism was more important than any single organization's immediate advantage. Felix Carucci was there. Madeline Croft was there. Vincent Morrow had sent a representative. Vincent himself was dealing with the consequences of the Crestline documentation, not catastrophically, but significantly. Theodorus was there. 4 other figures who had not been present at the Meridian meeting, but who had received careful, specific overtures in the weeks following. Vivian chaired the meeting. Not from the head of the table, she sat at the middle of one side, which was the position from which you could see everyone equally and from which you could be seen equally, and which communicated something specific about the function she was intending to occupy, which was not sovereign, but center. The first item on the agenda was a territorial dispute between 2 of the organizations present, a dispute that had been simmering for 8 months and had come within a week of becoming violent twice. She had read the documentation on both sides. She had spoken separately to both parties. She began the session not by offering a solution, but by asking both parties to describe what they understood the other party's core concern to be. Neither of them got it right on the first try. She waited. On the second try, one of them came close enough that the other party's posture shifted in a small but visible way. And that shift was the beginning of everything, because it was the moment when a dispute between 2 organizations stopped being a collision of incompatible positions and became, instead, a problem that 2 parties were in the same room trying to solve. She had done this thousands of times. She knew exactly what it looked like and what it required and how long it took and where it could go wrong. She did not find it simple. She found it, as she had always found it, difficult in the specific way that things are difficult when they matter, and when the difficulty is the work and not an obstacle to the work. The meeting lasted 4 hours. 1 dispute was resolved, 1 was deferred for additional information, and 1 was referred to a subcommittee of 2 council members who would report back at the following session. It was not spectacular. It was not the kind of thing that anyone outside the room would have recognized as significant. But when the 9 people left the Westchester estate that afternoon, 2 of them who had arrived as adversaries left having shaken hands. And the handshake was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a conversation that would take months to fully resolve. But it was a beginning, and beginnings made from honest conversation rather than fear were the only kind that held. Roman Viscari's cooperation with federal authorities was, in the end, comprehensive. His lawyers were good and his information was better, and the outcome was not what it might have been for a man who cooperated less fully. He spent 2 years in a facility in Virginia and emerged at 63 as a man who had been stripped of almost everything he had built and who had, in the stripping, arrived at the beginning of understanding what he had actually built and what he had merely held. He did not attempt to contact Vivian. She did not contact him. There was no formal procedure for the end of their 22 years together, no document that closed it, because what they had been to each other had never existed in the formal record in the way that mattered, and its ending didn't either. It simply became the past, which is the only place things go when they are finished. She wore the pale circle on her ring finger for 6 months after the Crestline night, not as a statement. She simply didn't think about it. And then one morning she did think about it, and she looked at it and thought about the groove the ring had left in the skin, and thought about what it meant that skin, which is a living thing and always changing, had retained the shape of something that was no longer there. And she thought about how long it would take to change back, and she thought that the answer was probably exactly as long as it needed to take. Dario Mantovese cooperated fully. His testimony was specific and useful and cost him the things it was appropriate for it to cost him. The 18 months of his double position were documented and accounted for, and the accounting was not clean. He had drawn a line at the contingency and had held it, and that line was noted in the record as what it was. Not exoneration, but evidence of a man who had been placed inside an impossible position and had, at a specific moment, decided that some things were not negotiable. She did not know, for a long time, what to do with Dario. He had been, for 22 years, the person she thought of as the closest thing to a consistent presence in a world full of contingent ones. He had been, for 18 months, something she did not have a precise word for. Both things were true, and both things lived in the same history. 6 months after Crestline, she received a letter. Handwritten. 3 pages. She recognized the handwriting before she read a word. She read it twice, standing at the kitchen counter of the apartment she had moved into in February. Her apartment, her name, a building she had chosen for no reason except that she liked the light in the morning and there was a good diner 2 blocks east. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It did not perform remorse in the way of something designed to produce a specific response. It was an account of the 18 months in his own voice, explaining what had happened and how it had happened and what it had felt like to be inside it and what he understood now about the choices he had made that he had not understood then. It was honest the way Dario was honest when he was not being strategic, which was the same quality she had valued in him for 22 years and had not known, until she saw it absent, how much she'd relied on. She did not write back immediately. She put the letter in a drawer and she went to work, which that morning involved a phone call with Madeline Croft about a situation in New England and a separate call with Felix Carucci about the Carucci organization's formal application for full council membership, which she was in the process of evaluating with the care it deserved, because evaluating things with the care they deserved was the only way she knew how to do anything. She thought about the letter, and Dario, and the 22 years, and the 18 months, and the line he had held, and the things that don't resolve cleanly but that can, in time, become something you know how to carry, in the way that scar tissue knows how to carry the fact of what formed it without being defined entirely by that formation. She thought about it in the way she thought about most difficult things, which was while doing something else. The phone calls, the meetings, the 4-hour sessions in the Westchester room where people who had arrived as adversaries were asked, patiently and repeatedly, to try to understand what the other person was actually afraid of. She would write back eventually. She was not yet sure what she would say. She was sure that what she said would be honest, which was the only criterion she had ever held herself to in any room she'd ever sat in, and which had cost her things and given her things in roughly equal measure, and which she had no intention of abandoning in the aftermath of an education as expensive as the one the last 48 hours of her 53rd year had provided. Outside the Westchester window, on the morning of the 10th session, the Atlantic was visible as a gray line at the edge of the lawn's horizon. She sat at the middle of the table and watched the 9 people take their seats around her and felt the room come to order in the specific way that rooms come to order when the person at the center of them has earned the right to call them to order through the slow, unglamorous, unphotographable accumulation of being reliable. It was not power. She had had access to power for 22 years, and she understood its texture and its cost and its fundamental instability, the way it required constant maintenance and produced constant anxiety and delivered, at the end of its longest run, a man sitting in a harbor warehouse at midnight, looking at the woman beside him as though he was seeing, for the first time, what he had been given and what he had done with it. This was different. This was the kind of authority that accrues to someone who shows up and does the difficult thing and then shows up again the next time it needs to be done, without requiring the room to acknowledge the showing up. It was the kind that couldn't be stripped in a ballroom because it didn't live in a ballroom. It lived in the specific and repeated evidence of someone who could be trusted to tell the truth in hard rooms and to stay in those rooms until the truth had done what it needed to do. She had been building it for 22 years without knowing that was what she was building. Now she was building it on purpose, in a structure designed for it, with her name on the door. She opened the morning's first file. "Let's begin," she said. And they did. She opened the morning's first file, and the first file was the Hargrove situation, which had been sitting unresolved on the council's preliminary docket for 3 weeks because the Hargrove organization's senior leadership had not yet formally acknowledged the council's existence as a legitimate mediation body, and their non-acknowledgement was not hostile. It was cautious, the caution of people who had watched structures rise and fall for 30 years and who required evidence of durability before committing to anything new. She understood this. She had always understood it. Durability was not declared. It was demonstrated, session by session, resolution by resolution, in the accumulation of kept commitments and honest assessments and the specific willingness to tell a party something they did not want to hear, when what they did not want to hear was what the situation actually required. The Hargrove question was on the table not because she had invited it, but because it had arrived, a representative, a younger man named Tess Hargrove, who was the granddaughter of the organization's founder and who had, in the 3 weeks since Crestline, been conducting her own assessment of the council's legitimacy with the methodical attention of someone who has been raised to take positions seriously and does not intend to take this one lightly. Tess had requested an observer seat, not membership. An observer seat which meant she would attend the session, watch the proceedings, and report back to the Hargrove organization's senior figures without any formal commitment on their part. Vivian had granted this without hesitation and without condition, because an observer who arrives skeptical and leaves having seen something real is worth more than a member who joins because joining seemed expedient. Tess Hargrove sat against the wall, outside the table, with a notepad and the flat measuring expression of someone conducting an evaluation she intends to complete before forming a conclusion. She was 31 years old, and she looked, Vivian thought, like someone who had been told all her life that the world she was inheriting was one thing and was currently in the process of determining whether that was true. The morning's second item was more delicate. It concerned a debt arrangement between 2 council members, one of them the Theodorus organization, one of them a newer figure named Callum Reese, who ran a mid-size operation out of Connecticut and whose council membership was 6 weeks old and still provisional. The debt arrangement predated the council and had been structured under terms that, in the current environment, one party argued were no longer equitable and the other party argued were binding regardless of environmental changes. This was the kind of dispute that had historically been resolved by whoever had more leverage applying it until the other party capitulated, which was a resolution in the sense that it produced an outcome, but not a resolution in the sense that it produced a settled situation, because the party that capitulated remembered the capitulation and waited for the moment when the leverage ratio changed. She asked Theodorus to speak first. He spoke with the compression of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and has said less of it than he prepared to say, which was Theodorus's particular form of discipline. He laid out the original arrangement in precise terms, the subsequent changes in the operating environment that had created the current dispute, and his organization's position on what equitable resolution looked like. Then she asked Reese. Callum Reese was 45 and had the particular energy of a man who had spent his adult life in environments where the only way to hold ground was to hold it loudly, and he was visibly working against that instinct in this room, because he understood, with the practical intelligence of someone who has assessed his situation accurately, that the council's mediation framework was the only thing currently standing between his provisional membership and a leverage situation he would not win. He laid out his position. It was not unreasonable. It was also not, in several specific particulars, entirely accurate. She let him finish. She waited a beat. The restructuring in October, she said, the one you're describing as an environmental change outside either party's control. Walk me through the sequence. Reese walked her through it. She listened with the full attention that she brought to every account she received in these sessions, which was not the attention of someone waiting for the inaccuracy to expose it, but the attention of someone who needed the complete picture before the picture could be addressed. The timeline you're describing, she said when he finished, puts the restructuring decision approximately 3 weeks before the terms in question were finalized. A pause. Which means the environmental change you're citing as external, she said, occurred while the arrangement was still being negotiated. The room was quiet. Reese looked at the table. Something in his posture shifted. Not collapse, but the specific adjustment of a man recalibrating the version of events he has been presenting to himself as well as the room. There may have been, he said carefully, some awareness of the incoming restructuring at that time. Yes, she said, not as an accusation, as a confirmation. She looked at Theodorus. Were you aware? No, Theodorus said. Flat, direct, and she believed him. She turned back to Reese. What you're describing is an arrangement that was finalized with information asymmetry. You had knowledge that affected the risk calculation. Theodorus did not. She paused. That's a different problem than the one you presented. Another pause. Longer. Yes, Reese said. The single word cost him something. She watched it cost him. She sat for a moment. The original arrangement stands, she said, modified by a single adjustment to the interest calculation for the period of the information gap, which the Council will determine on the basis of standard documentation. Both parties will have the opportunity to review the calculation before it's finalized. She looked at Reese. And you will provide full disclosure of the October restructuring timeline to Council records within 5 days. It was not a punishment, it was a consequence, which is a different thing. A consequence is structural. It addresses the gap in the record rather than performing retribution, and it gives the person who created the gap the opportunity to close it themselves, which is the only kind of closing that produces a person who doesn't create the same gap again. Reese nodded. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has just been accurately read by someone with the authority to do something about it, and who has chosen, correctly, not to contest the reading. Against the wall, Tess Hargrove was writing in her notepad. Vivian did not look at her. She moved to the third item. The afternoon session ran long, a territorial overlap in New Jersey that required 2 hours of detailed mapping before the core issue revealed itself, which was not the territorial overlap at all, but a years-old personal dispute between two mid-level figures in the respective organizations that had been allowed to calcify into institutional policy. Once the personal dispute was named, once she had asked the right sequence of questions in the right order, and the room had arrived collectively at the thing that was actually driving the surface conflict, the territorial solution became relatively straightforward. It was always this. 22 years of it had not made it mechanical because the human element was never mechanical, but it had given her the pattern recognition to know where to look and how to ask and when to wait and when to push. And those 4 things, in combination, were the work. At 4:15, the 10th session of the Ashcroft Council concluded. People gathered their coats and their notes and moved toward the estate's exit in the loose, slightly relieved way of people who have spent a long day in a room with difficult material and are grateful for the afternoon air. Vivian stayed at the table. She did this after every session, gave the room time to clear, sat with the residue of the day's work, made the notes she needed to make while the details were still specific and present. She was writing when she heard footsteps stop near the table. Tess Hargrove. The younger woman stood at the edge of the table with her notepad in her hand and her coat already on and the evaluating expression she'd worn all day, which had not changed precisely, but had acquired a different quality over the course of the afternoon. Less assessment, more something that didn't yet have a name but was moving in the direction of one. That New Jersey situation, Tess said. The territorial overlap. Yes. When did you know it wasn't actually about the territory? Vivian looked up. About 40 minutes in, when the DeLuca representative used the same phrasing twice in reference to the other party's senior figure, the same unusual phrasing, word for word, which meant he'd said it to himself enough times that it had become automatic. People don't repeat specific phrasing about situations they haven't thought about extensively. Tess was quiet for a moment. But you didn't name it for another hour and 20 minutes. No. Why? Because naming it before they were ready to hear it named would have produced denial rather than recognition, Vivian said, and denial closes rooms. Recognition opens them. She paused. You can know what the problem is long before it's useful to say what the problem is. The gap between those 2 moments is most of the work. Tess looked at her notepad, then at Vivian. My grandmother knew your name, she said. She talked about you. Not in the context of the Viscari organization, just your name when certain situations came up, when something difficult had been resolved that shouldn't have been resolvable. She paused. I didn't understand what she meant until today. Vivian held this. She thought about the grandmother, a woman she had dealt with twice, 15 years ago, in situations she remembered specifically because they had required the particular kind of patience that circumstances offer no credit for. She was a careful person, Vivian said. It was useful to work with her. Tess nodded, a beat. I'm going to recommend full membership, she said, pending the senior leadership's review, which I think will go the way I recommend. She paused. I wanted you to know before the formal communication. Thank you, Vivian said. Tess left. Vivian sat alone in the Westchester room for another 20 minutes. The Atlantic was no longer visible through the window. The angle of the late afternoon light had moved past the point where the gray line of it was distinguishable from the sky. The room was quiet and held the particular stillness of a space that has been used for something difficult and is now resting. She finished her notes. She capped her pen. She looked at the table, which was scarred in one corner from decades of use, and the scar was comfortable rather than deficient, evidence of a surface that had been worked on rather than preserved. She put her notes in her bag and her bag on her shoulder, and she stood. She thought briefly about the Dario letter in the drawer of her kitchen. She thought about what she would write when she was ready to write it, which she was closer to than she had been 6 months ago, but was not yet, and that was fine, because some things required exactly the time they required, and no less. She thought about Roman in Virginia, who was in the 3rd month of what would be 2 years, and who was, by all accounts, cooperating fully and speaking honestly, which was the most she had asked of him, and the most she had expected, and which was, she had decided, enough to be enough. She thought about the pale circle on her ring finger, which was fainter now than it had been in November, and which would, in time, disappear entirely, and which she observed sometimes with the neutral attention of someone watching a natural process proceed at its own pace. She walked out of the Westchester estate into the late afternoon. Her car was waiting. Not Emmett. She had not kept Emmett. She had not wanted the continuity of that particular thing, but a woman named Rosa who was direct and punctual, and who did not make conversation unless conversation was invited, which were the qualities Vivian required in a driver and had specified exactly. In the car, she looked out the window at the countryside moving past. The November trees, the particular quality of late afternoon light in the northeast in late autumn, which is gray and amber and somehow precise, as if the year is conducting its own kind of honest accounting before the close. She thought about what she had told Roman in the warehouse. I'm going to build something better, not bigger. Better. She was building it. Session by session, dispute by dispute, the slow accumulation of a structure that derived its durability not from fear or from the authority of a single name, but from the demonstrated reliability of a process. It was not spectacular. It would not appear in any record that the public had access to. The people who would benefit from it most would benefit from it without knowing its name, because the best outcome of effective mediation was the absence of the conflict it prevented, and absences were invisible by definition. She had spent 22 years doing invisible work. She was still doing invisible work. The difference was that now the work had her name on it, and the name was hers alone, and that was not a small difference. It was the difference between a foundation and a floor. The floor was what people stood on and noticed, and the foundation was what made standing on the floor possible. And she had spent 22 years being the foundation, and she was still the foundation, and she was also now the floor. She was both, and she had built both, and she would maintain both, and when the next crisis came, and it would come, because crises in this world were not a matter of if, but of when, and what shape, and whether the structure you had built was adequate to meet them, she would meet it the same way she had met this one, with clarity, with patience, with the willingness to stay in the room until the truth had done what the truth needed to do. Rosa pulled onto the highway heading south, and the city assembled itself on the horizon, the way it always did, slowly and then all at once, its skyline rising into the gray November sky with the absolute self-assurance of a thing that has been there a very long time and intends to continue being there, indifferent to any particular human drama being conducted within it, but containing all of them, everyone, in its vast and ordinary and inexhaustible life. Vivian Ashcroft watched the city come toward her and felt, underneath the tiredness of the day and the weight of the month and the particular accumulated cost of the year she had just moved through, Something that was not happiness in the simple sense, but was adjacent to it. The satisfaction of a person who has done the work they were made to do, in the way they were made to do it, on their own terms, at a cost they understood and accepted and would pay again. She had lost a marriage and a structure and 22 years of invisible labor and the version of herself that had been willing to remain invisible. She had also lost, finally and permanently, the need to. What remained was the work, and the work was enough, and she was enough for the work, and the morning would come again, and she would sit at the middle of a table in a room full of difficult people trying to solve difficult problems. And she would ask the right questions in the right order and wait for the right moments and stay in the rooms that needed staying in. It was not a crown. It was not a throne. It was not the kind of thing that anyone would recognize from the outside as what it was. It was exactly what she had always been building, and it would last.